Everybody in internet guitar geekdom land, what's up? I'm
Hello,
seeing
hello.
that's Brian from Top Hat Amps. Now, we haven't seen each other in like, I don't know, 15 years or something. It's like gotta
At
be.
least, yeah. Been gone since '05 from California.
Well, isn't that crazy? So maybe it's 16 years. God, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy, crazy, crazy. But you, of course, Top Hat Amps, and you were one of the people that taught me so much about tube amps back in the day, a long, long time ago. I learned a lot from you. And I'm really glad that we're reconnecting and stuff because it's, you're just a wealth of knowledge when it comes to amps, tube amps, and
I appreciate that. Yeah, that's what I was hoping to. I've watched many of your talks with Friedman and others and Shure and all the guys. So, yeah, there's a couple things I wanted to chime in with you on clarifying what does what and stuff. Particularly, I remember there was a thing about phase inverters and
yeah.
what you thought of the way phase inverters distort and stuff in there. So, but yeah, hopefully we can get into some different amps that use similar arrangements, whether it's top boost versus basement or Marshall. How different stages are coupled. Sometimes you have a fatter stage coupled leaner. Sometimes you have a leaner stage coupled fatter. These kinds of things. What does what? But and even about masters and pre-phase inverter masters and stuff and what that does to the distortion and all that at the phase inverter. But we
Yeah.
could start backgrounds. I don't know wherever else you want to start with, but hopefully we can touch on some
Well, yeah,
amp
let's
stuff there.
let's do that. Like, I mean, my history with you goes back to we're trying to figure that out just before we went live here. And I think it was probably 97, 98, 99, maybe 98 when we first connected. And my first amp that I got from you was a King Royale, which is your sort of take on the classic AC30 circuit, I think, back in the
Right.
day. I had a scripty combo King Royale, and then not too long after that, I picked up an Amplexador. Now, the King Royale was a combo, and it ended up, I'm not sure where. It's one of those things where, like, what happened to that amp? And I had a great tone with it. And I don't know why I ever got rid of it, but I did. But now I have another one right here, and you folks can't see because this screen split. But anyway, it's right here, and that's the exact same era, the amp that I had back from you in the day. It's just
Right, right.
instead. So, and they're always just terrific amps. And you were there right at the beginning. I mean, let's talk about the background actually of your background, because you were. I mean, when I think about boutique amps, it was like there was Wizard around that time. There was Matchless. I mean, it was almost like Mesa was still almost good. I mean, they were becoming mainstream. There was Soldano, I guess, but you were there right at the
Yeah,
beginning.
there was a few. I think Matchless was late '80s, and yeah, there was like the old Kendrick guy was around. But yeah, Soldano. I think VHT on the more higher end, and Bogner. I had a Bogner right before I started building amps. So a lot of those bigger, more higher gain stuff coming out of the late '80s into the '90s. There was a lot of there was I'd say more of those than even yet. Well, there was a few came in with me. I think maybe Victoria and some of the Tweeds were fairly big back then as well. So there was a handful, but and Dr. Z I think was pretty close as well in time. So there was a number of them. Another batch came in, I think, right around '01 or so, something like that. But I started late '94 is when I started Top Hat. Um, but yeah, and like many, I started doing custom stuff. Like what do you want? I'll build it for you, and a lot of basement Marshall type of stuff initially.
I
Um,
remember you were doing custom one-off kind of stuff, right?
yeah, in the very first couple of years, and it was about '96 or so when I started getting my own models and standardizing Club Royale and Club Deluxe, and then Plexador, and then the Royales, Club and King. We had the Embassy early on. That was like a 466 version of the King Royale. So fairly quickly got the product line going there and standardized them rather than doing one off. We were still doing custom colors and all that sort of thing, but not as much exact custom design. But yeah, and I kind of, because I'm more a Marshall guy by history, generally speaking, I stayed more on the British. Like I said, there was starting to be a fleet of even Fender coming back and reissuing all that Tweed stuff. So Tweed, right when I was coming out, there was a big push and load of Tweed stuff.
Mm.
And to me, Fender was doing it. Others were already doing that, and
Yeah,
that's a
Kendrick,
great.
Victoria, and all them.
Right, that's what I mean. So I chose to go with the more English route, which was more my bailiwick, anyways, with Celestians that were still made properly. To me, that's still a somewhat of a problem on the American front. You did a video which intrigued me on the A50 from Celestion as a sort of American, more American sounding thing that I just got some sent to me, and I'm going to try those, especially on my more American amp like my Rialto Reverb one and that sort of thing. But to me, not having a real even C12N like a
Mm.
early mid 60s heavy duty ceramic, but there's really to me still no good proper replicas of the Alnicos of Jensen or any of that from the 50s. So speakers are hypercritical in making sounds, and that's part of why I went the way I went, was that to me the speakers at least were available to do the British thing right.
That's interesting. I mean, the speaker is like, at least to me, I always say like it's half the sound. It's like,
Oh, it's the voice. It's speaking to you. It's the final translation of
yeah.
everything the guitar and the amp is doing. And yeah, I tell people you can ruin a top hat real quick. You put bad tubes and a bad speaker,
Mm.
and I wouldn't like it. I mean,
Yeah, it's that final
you,
filter over
it,
the whole sound. Yeah.
well, and especially when they're not complicated amps, when they don't have 6 preamp tubes and circuit board and eight, looking like a space shuttle board inside your amp, then it's somewhat less critical, but on everything from what's coming into it down to the speaker. But when you're hearing everything, the tubes are very important. Output transformers hypercritical, and speaker, those everything else, everything's important. Again, when you don't have that many parts and pieces, but definitely the speaker is uber important. And
Yeah. What do you
not
feel
that
about
what's
sorry,
that?
I didn't want to interrupt you, but I was just going to say, you mentioned tubes too. How do you feel about the current state of what's available tube wise, and have you had any problems, headaches with,
Well, only recently now, for almost ever, I never used Chinese tubes, but Tube Amp Doctor finally got me to use them, and I started using more and more, generally on the power tube side than preamp tubes. But I'm generally happy. To me, I use mostly tongue cell 12AX7s. They're a medium plate, medium gain. I don't like them. I don't need every ounce of gain. Some circuits and amps are designed around a Chinese 12AX7 where you need that leaner, extra gainy thing that they do, and you put in Russians and it will sound very dull and boring, like you put a blanket over it. Even when I was very young, like a Bogner or whatever, if you something like that, high gain, lots of tubes in it, and it's meant for a whole set of bright, clear, gainy tubes, and then you put a warmer, creamier, sweeter tube all across, and it's like, it sounds like you got a blanket over it. So
That's what I always found with the traditional JJ12. The ECC 83 sounded to me just really like a blanket, and just about, which I guess some people like, but
to me, JJs are a really well-made tube in general across the board. I use their rectifier tubes. They're the least
yeah.
rattly GZ34s, and I use their EZ81s. I use those always. But they're hard on the to me they're military stud sounding, whether power or preamp tubes. I know you mentioned one that's a newer one that you liked, which I'm trying to remember. Is it
That's
the
the
803?
E83CC, which is not to be confused with the ECC 83. But the
Right,
the
right,
the
right.
E83 has a beautiful top end to me, and it's like, this is nice and clear, and it just has a really, really good tone to it. And it's just that traditional ECC 83 that they've had for years, to me, always sounded a little dark. Just that particular tube. I mean, they make other tubes that I really quite like, that
Right.
6V6 is great, I think. But
Of the JJ?
yeah, I quite like
Yeah.
it. I mean,
That one's not for me. It's extra tall, and it to me, like, see, their tubes, they're the as a company, they least try to replicate old real tubes. They just
hmm,
make good tubes that pin out right and work fine and last a long time. Matchless used to use, like, he used to like GEs in his C30s and stuff. The closest thing to an old GE is the JJ, especially EL84s.
Mm.
that are harder and again more military studly, which he seemed to like, as well as filtering them harder. He liked that strong, loud, clear tube. I'm because it's the way it breaks over into distortion is the critical thing to me. That's
Mm.
what my ears are sensitive that I'm dialed into, both on how loose or tight an amp is, and but it's that front edge of that note. Is it bang or is it fwang, fwang, where it gives just a little bit before it slaps you? Um, Fender, it's a different world. A straight Fender blackface or something, and you want a big rockabilly clang or something, then maybe you want a big hard tube. But when especially Class A, they're always breaking over into distortion.
Mm.
So that break and that jangle around between clean and dirty is very important.
Well, for
Now,
that, the JJ, I bet that's why maybe you said you don't like their 6v6 because I know it doesn't quite respond like a traditional, like an old tongue soul or
well,
something.
6Vs are interesting. Early on, when I used them, I was using the Russian, and they're very soft and creamy. And even a good old NOS tube, if you put in a lot of my amps, say my Club Deluxe early on, even that would sound somewhat like a JJ, very hard. They just
Mm.
see. Here's what I will tell you. What I find, even especially about a 6v6, they need more bottom end let through to them to make them give a little. That if you put them in medium neutral, they can sound hard, but they need the bottom end to squat and fill them and around them and to not just hold straight. That's and
Mm.
that's what Fenders have. They have a ton of low end coming through. Where a top boost, it kind of even just sunk into me the other day that somebody was a friend of mine, but top boost like a treble booster. It's telling you it's a leaner upper end thing. It's got the top boosted, not all boosted. It's in the name, if you will. And so especially say in an EL84 Class A Vox type amp that distorts a lot, distorts easily. And that's sort of where I would differentiate myself from some other companies, in particular, say a Matchless, which again a great built amp, great reputation, but just we different builders have different tastes and what we're looking for and what eliminating the negative and accentuating the positive. How do you do that?
Mm.
And I start being a traditional guy, wanting them to do what the old original things do. And an old early 60s AC30 is a sweet, creamy, pillowy amp even with Vox Blues. It's not hard and clear. And that's what I'm saying. There's other amps. I think I would even say, trying to be neutrally opinionated here. For example, a Dr. Z leans towards the Fender side of a Vox. Like he sort of twists its arm from a straight Vox to being a more, and that's why I like your Brad Paisley and that sort of thing works really well in that kind, because it's almost a Fender Vox, where
Mm.
mine by nature, even again from my taste early on, especially, we're a little more Marshall Vox. Like it's a Vox top boost, but and I would even note that to everybody if they're not familiar, a top boost Vox, a 59 basement, and a early Marshall are really all the same arrangement in the preamp. And that's what I was mentioning early. We could maybe get into why there's slight differences and why you even get a teeny bit more gain out of a top boost than you do out of a basement or a Marshall.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, just because what you just said, I mean, you've got so much knowledge about this stuff, and even just, we could gloss over something, and then it'll be like, what was that, and I'll forget because you'll be. But you mentioned a 59 Bassman, an early Vox, and an early Marshall
Yeah,
circuit, very similar.
when Vox top boosted, they add that third, that middle preamp tube that's identical to a basement or a Marshall.
The cathode follower
Yeah,
stage.
with the gain stage and the cathode follower to drive through. And then they used an odd, Vox used the odd, we actually came from a Tweed Gibson, is where the odd bass treble with that extreme 1 meg treble knob. They got it from Tweed Gibson,
Really?
but that's the odd thing that's one difference, minor difference. The arrangement is the same
Okay, so
between those
the
amps.
preamp is arranged the same, but the EQ is a little different in the Vox, more like
So
a
the
Gibson.
bass in them, if you have an adjustable mid, I add an adjustable mid to the Vox arrangement, which didn't have it. That's just leaving it fixed where the mid is. But Yeah, almost most all normal amps have a 250K pot for the treble. So when you and it's the main valve. A lot of people might not know that, but in effect, the bass comes into one side of the treble knob, and the treble direct path goes in the other side, and that's it comes together back into one and leaves out of the middle wiper of the treble knob. So it's got 250K. So when you go all the way up into 250K, you can only block the mid and bass department with 250K of resistance. The Vox use a big 1 meg. So when you go way up and you get past that break point at about 7, it just really thins out and completely blocks the whole bass department.
That's why it's apparent losing apparent gain when you turn it up on a
Oh
couple.
yeah, because bottom end is volume of signal with gain, right?
That's really interesting.
So,
Yeah.
but yeah, it can just totally block it, and vice versa. A little less on the downside. You're getting all the bass side, but it's just that's some people used to call it an interactive tone control because it's a stronger valve control between treble and bass, if you will.
Hmm.
And even the note that mid is, even though you'll see in the circuit that the bass knobs in those normal either of those EQs, it prevents it from going to 0 on the bass by using the mid knobs 25K classically to be a bottom out. So when it's on 0, you still have to see the 25K going to ground. But the mid knob is really a separate isolated thing that is either sucking out mid range, or the more resistance you have in a mid knob, you can remove it from the circuit and not kill any mids. And that adds a lot of mids. That's where the one smart thing, in particular of Dumble and the Dumble EQ, which I've always used on my Fender type circuit, he totally isolates. So the bass just does the bass, the treble does the treble, but the mid, he puts 100K in there. And now when you go up and remove it with 100K, it really lets all the mid, almost like an EQ bypass. You get a lot of gain. Like on my Rialto Reverb, my old Ambassador, you get a lot of gain. So, and here's the numbers. So when Fender fixes the mid range, it's at 6.8K off of ground. So call it 7K. When they give you a mid knob on a super or a twin, they give you a whopping 10K pot, so you can get 3 more K than you can. It's still relatively mid sucked even on 10. The classic Bassman Marshall is a 25K, so that pretty well helps you remove it. You put 100K and wow, it completely removes all that mid killing, and you get a ton of gain through the mid range. But that's what's going on in the EQ, anyways.
But that's a Dumble. So hold on one sec there, because it's just for folks in layman speak. This is why, like on a Marshall with the 25K traditional mid pot on, say, a Marshall Plexi circuit, if you turn the mids on 10, it almost seems like you're getting more apparent gain. In the interesting thing that we discovered about the Van Halen amp was supposedly it had a 50K mid. So it's like, it's not a mod, but it's like, hey, you're getting a little more gain actually than a stock Plexi would have, and it fills out a little bit because it's essentially lifting the EQ out of the way of the sound going through, right? I mean,
Well, that's what a bass knob does.
gain-wise.
The bass knob, in effect, the treble, especially the way you even draw it in a circuit. But so you take the whole signal in an EQ and you literally split it between a treble, a mid, and a bass cap, whether it has a bass treble knob or whether it has bass, mid, and treble. There's no resistance on the treble path because the treble's frequencies are small. They go shooting straight through. That's the direct path. There's one resistor that makes it work to get over to the bigger mid and bass department. That's called the slope resistor. And then you've got your big mid and bass caps. And like I say, the bass comes over to one side of the treble and the direct treble pass on the other, and that's the outlet. So you regroup it back together. But of that, what's shifting the treble knob up off of ground is the bass knob. It's literally 1 meg to 0. So it's raising and lowering the impedance of the whole EQ circuit. And that's why when you now in a Bassman Marshall top boost circuit, if you have a pre-phase inverter master, you go right out of the treble and straight into that master. Now the master's in effect in parallel with the bass knob, and when you go way down on that pre-phase inverter master, you're lowering the impedance of the whole EQ, and it kills the bottom end, and you're left with mid and upper end and no bottom end left, which has always been why anybody else in the world can't understand this, that when you master down, so I tell you, once you're about below halfway on a master, a pre-phase inverter master, don't have the treble indoor presence any higher than the master is. because when you start choking it down below halfway, you're losing your bottom end. So you need to turn the treble down a pretty good amount, the mid down some. But let's say you get to where you're barely cracked on off of 0 on the master, you might as well just turn the treble off, and you'll want typically a good starting point is the mid at about a quarter of the way up, and that's your treble knob now. Because see what it's done is it shifted the EQ points by lowering all the references down closer to ground. The trebles kind of become super treble. The mid is moved up to the treble department, and the bass is almost up into the mid department. They've all lowered down.
So this applies to let's say the classic JMP or JCM 800. That you would recommend running the treble and the mid quite low when you got the master down around 2 or 3. When most people are complaining,
inverter, if it's a three-phase inverter master, and people are always amazed early on, like at the NAMM show or something, I'd be playing, and by playing my Amplexador and just doing that adjustment, it just makes the spectrum sound more like it does when you're up loud on the amp.
Wow.
In the normal mid-range settings. But you just notice you're way too thin and bright, and it's really, like I say, you could almost even I've even thought about like a presence knob. You can almost have a double pot with the master and the presence. That the louder you go, the more presence you can have, but the lower you go, the less presence you want. And like I say, they should almost just go together. But certainly down at 0 to 3, 4 on the master, keeping the presence and the treble way down will keep it from getting all sizzly bright with no bottom end. But anyways, that's what's happening. One other point I would make here. So then between the two worlds, the two main algorithms is the Bassman Marshall top boost, and we could still get into the gain stages and the way a top boost does it slightly different than a Bassman Marshall. But the other is what I call the 60s Fender, which started with the blonde Bassman, the non-bass side of a blonde Bassman, is the what became the blackface preamp that's in both sides of a blackface, the simple side and the vibrato tremolo side, or reverb vibrato side. They put it all the way in the front. So input to gain stage, everything does that straight. In a Fender blonde Bassman or blackface Bassman, boom, you kill it immediately into the EQ, and that's why those act much more like gain knobs than a Marshall Bassman type does at the end of the preamp. So this is what we want to point out. It's right up front or it's right at the very end. Very, very different. Up front, because it's just getting up steam and going, and you immediately bog it down with the EQ, like on my Rialto Reverb, and somewhat like what a Dumble does as well with an EQ bypass. When you drop that load of the EQ, boom, the gain goes up gigantic because that Fender kills it so much, because it's just getting going. You haven't built up steam. When you put it at the end, you build up all the steam of the preamp, and now you're cramming it through the EQ. So it's ee-wee-wee instead of blee, where it's just barely getting up and going in a Fender.
Got it. Yeah. And you're talking about, you're talking about where the EQ is placed in the preamp circuit, whether
in the algorithm, right? So you get gain stage, EQ feeds the volume in a blackface or a blonde Bassman. The volume knob then feeds the second stage. Second stage feeds the phase inverter output section. In your Bassman top boost Marshall arrangement, it's gain stage, volume knob, second gain stage with the cathode follower, plow through the EQ at the end, and then to the phase inverter. But like I say, you built up all the steam with both gain stages and the cathode follower, and you're plowing through that EQ with much greater push. And so it doesn't kill it nearly as much as when you do it right up front. There's good and bad to both, but especially in that Fender type up front, when you get that big mid knob and remove that killing of the mid range, that's what I mean. It picks the gain way up on a Fender type circuit. So even without touching anything else, it's a huge gain boost. It just makes it more rock and roll.
Yeah, I've got a Bassman that Roy Blankenship did a mod to, which essentially lifts the EQ. I think that classic kind of like where you take a Bassman and then you pull the EQ out, and it just sounds like all of a sudden, like you say, it's like, whoa, became a Marshall all of a sudden or something.
You're talking about a blonde Bassman type thing?
No, it's a blackface Bassman, but on channel 1, he's got a switch. He changed the deep switch or whatever, where it's now lifting the EQ, I think. So you got all that gain, just like it's dirty.
Oh, it's huge when you remove that. I will tell you similarly, that is why a black Princeton is so weak. A black Princeton is basically a Tweed Deluxe with an EQ stage. And when you bog it's so much
Mm,
cleaner though than a Tweed Deluxe is because you killed it with that EQ and
interesting.
it can't quite get up and going after those. So I don't know if you know my new Rialto, which is on a Princeton chassis, but a 112 arrangement. And I do a birch cab rather than a pine cab. And boy, let me tell you, there's a big world of difference there. When I
Hmm.
was R&D in that, I had a 10-inch and a 12-inch regular pine Princeton cab, and then took the very same speaker out of the 12 and put it in one of my normal 112 combos, like what a Club Royale comes in. And oh my God, the revelation of wow, I didn't real. I mean, and now it's one of those things. Once you're conscious of it, I
Hmm.
can hear it on even TV when somebody's playing a Fender amp. You know, to the mic, that sort of mushy softness of pine isn't such a bad thing directly with the mic right in front of the speaker. But to my ear, wow, it just garbles. Now, when you're clean to medium drive, again, not a problem. But once you get an amp cranked up and bang, it's ready to rock and roll,
Hmm.
that pine is just just puts a frog in its throat.
Interesting.
And Baltic birch is much harder and brighter, and bang, it's again that front edge of the note. So there's always a mix of things, but whether you got a Class A amp with a soft cab or a hard cab, which a soft greenback with a hard cab, a, a clearer, quicker speaker and a soft, there's just within speaker and cab, there's different sounds, but I really learned how much I did not like. I'll further the example, but it really woke me up to like, wow, pine. Early on, in about 97, 98, in an effort to get rid of some rattle, I went to pine for like a year or so,
Hmm.
making my amps, and they never bothered me then as much as later when I did the R&D on the Rialto reverb. But man, I just really have a dislike of pine at this point. For a Tweed Deluxe, they work fine like that. Again, it doesn't get into quite the. Now, if you put a Celestian in there and you wanted it to come over to Rockland more than just being a straight Tweed,
Yeah.
it might bother you a little bit. But so it's everything. You got to have a speaker that you hear the difference. But just, if you will, my poor ears are well tuned to Celestian speakers and Baltic birch cabs, and when I
There you
don't
go.
have it, it just sounds like it's not able to speak properly. But that's a
Well,
good
that's
thing.
part of
What
what
it,
I found with why I bonded with you. And you folks out there that haven't met Brian before or spoke with him, you're seeing why. When I met you in the '90s, I was like, wow, this guy knows a lot of stuff. And
well,
it
yeah,
was like I,
it's like
I
a
I would come to your
recipe.
shop and hang because it was like
Yeah,
every time I learned something. So
it's a recipe, right? Like cooking a
yeah,
nice meal or whatever, and all the parts and pieces, and what makes a great. We could branch up, but back to the R&D of. So what you can hear in my Rialto reverb. So what I realized when I was
which is
looking at
just to clarify, it's your kind of it started with a Princeton
it's a
black basement.
Princeton reverb platform.
Got it. And
What I
then you're
realized was that it uses the same phase inverter and roughly output section 2.6 Vs. The Tweed ran them, cathode biased, more like a Vox or whatever, more what you would call Class A, where any of the blacks do not do that, even the brown Princeton. But that it shared this phase inverter output section with a black Princeton non-reverb, with a brown Princeton, with a Tweed Deluxe, all
hmm,
shared roughly the same output section. So by switching stuff out of the full Princeton reverb circuit, so the first thing I did on that was take the tremolo out. There's a trillion tremolo pedals, and it's not the greatest tremolo to me anyways, but
right.
that allowed me to put the mid. So in those two positions, I now put the mid knob and ascend and return from the reverb. I've got a reverb bypass switch. I got an EQ bypass switch. I got a two-way bright switch, a British and an American, and then the high-low gain, which is switching in the second main gain stage of the main preamp.
Hmm.
By switching those things in and out, I can get you in that same arrangement. I get almost 5, 6 gears out of what would be a one-trick pony otherwise.
Yeah.
But by going to low gain, get rid of the reverb, get rid of the EQ, you're into Tweed Deluxe. The only thing you're missing is the tone knob. but that's why the two-way bright switch is very helpful to give you sort of two settings of what
Mm.
the tone knob would do and get you that upper end clarity that you're missing without the upper end of a tone knob. But and it comes out, again, you're not cathode biased, but otherwise it's 98% of that. And then when you click in that lower gain mode, the EQ, you're now in Black Princeton non-reverb mode. And let me tell you, not the most ass-kicking amp. It's about the cleanest, probably one of the cleanest amps Fender ever made.
Mm-hmm.
But as I recall, I see him now often with the Princeton reverb, but Mike Campbell of Tom Petty, I believe a lot of the early records there was a Princeton non-reverb.
Mm-hmm.
And like I say, very clean, but you dime it like some of your old Magnetones and other things that are very low gain, right? But you dime it and it's just perfect. Where for recording, not again in the full
Sure.
Marshall rock or whatever, but this perfect, rich, what people look for in a semi broken up kind of tone where it's not straight clean. It's definitely not way dirty, but it's very, very recordable. And to the microphone that doesn't need as much distortion as your ear wants to hear in a room, it's just exquisite. And very reasonable output level with 10, 12 watts, not much push. And
Yeah.
it's just great. And so that, to me, those two are worth the price of admission. The general Princeton reverb is great. And then in Princeton reverb mode, if you get rid of the EQ, you boost it up
More
and
gain.
you're hotter and still in the reverb mode, or you can put that back on, turn the reverb off, and now you're much gainier and ballsier. It would almost be like a blonde bassman, roughly, something like that.
Wow. Well, it
If
sounds like
you
a
turn them
great.
both off, you're into crazy elephant game that you can get about 4 or 5, but much hotter. But it's amazing that there's a pretty good amount of gain, especially with that mid knob, even in the Princeton reverb. But I just saw that I could get you all those gears in one amp. Now
Yeah.
it's the least simple user friendly, but it's kind of my magnum opus, I say, of design by getting you the most in one arrangement.
From tweed to blonde to blackface to.
Yeah, you're getting a whole bunch of gears in one. And I'm about to make a non-reverb Rialto for a guy who ordered one where for those hotter modes, it would be nice to have the master because then you could adjust that distortion better. And that is, don't let me forget, that's one I want to talk to you about having a master right in front of the phase inverter, where to me, that helps you smooth out the distortion rather than just make that quick point in either circuit, but where you've got that pre-phase inverter. It affects the EQ and the basement, tweed basement Marshall arrangement, but to me, you can sweeten it because this is what I want to make about phase inverter and phase inverter distortion. They're not generally meant, and they're used to varying degrees of amount of gain in a 12AX7. Let's just take those. Somewhat 12AT's meant to be hard and clean and not bend, feeding a cleaner black phase. But like I say, a Vox uses the 12AX7, uses very minimal gain and less gain in the phase inverter than a Bassman or a Marshall. And it's because it's feeding that very easy to distort EL84 output section. But you get a little more in a Marshall or a Bassman. But they can get, my point is they're not meant to be, though, in the normal sense of the two other main gain stages, to be a gain achieving dirty place. It's just meant to split it and feed the push pull output section.
Okay.
And it can get what I hear as overbaked. And that's what I'm saying, when you get 7 to 10 when you're way up high on them. And
Are you talking? Okay, 7 to 10 on a Plexi Marshall or a.
on a master volume where that's, well, yeah, no, I'm saying gain wise, if on your gain knob you're way up,
Yeah.
and now you're getting way up on the master. As I'm saying, if you have the master there. And what I'm saying is that, so let's say you're at the sweet spot on 7 on the preamp gain, and you're pretending you have no master and you're on 10 on the master.
We're talking about a let's take, just for argument's
Take
sake,
a Marshall,
a
whatever.
JMP or
Yeah.
with a master or
Even
JCM
even
800.
a late JMP JCM 800 type 2203, 2204, whatever.
Okay.
But if you try to well, it's a little different with those because those have a lot more gain, and you don't run the master on those on 10 like you do on a Plexi quite as much, right? Where you get quite aggressive and loud with that much gain. and the master. But the point I want to make is that if you, let's take a plexi, like I say, type arrangement, but you've got that master and you pretend it's not there. So it's on 10 and you got the gain up nice and 7, it's breaking up good. It's not quite as getting to the point where it's the problem yet. It would be more if you even went past 7 on the preamp. But what I'm getting at is when you go from 10 to 7, it'll change the output nil. It won't even hardly change it, but it'll smooth out, clear out the voice of the distortion, where it's still basically the same amount of distortion. It can just articulate it and not get what I call splattered out.
Like that kind of blocking distortion sound where
it's just cluttered and messy and not a smooth, sweet, good distortion. And that's part of the name of the game for me is distortion, the breaking over into distortion, and then a good distortion when you're into full saturated distortion, even the way the output transformer is compressing, saturating, and distorting when you reach those saturation when you're turning them way up. But my point is, you don't change the output much from 10 to 7, but you lower the window down so that the screaming elephant pouring into it, it can take it. Rather than wide open, it gets overwhelmed and it splatters it out into, to me, an uglier distortion.
And are you saying that's the phase inverter that is just getting overwhelmed?
Right, because it's not a normal gain stage. It's not a simple triode gain stage. This is split it, and it's grabbing a mirror image off the ground to reflect the negative version of the main positive flow of the amp. And yeah, it's a translator. We could discuss even that between that and a single edit amp, which most people don't like, and why it only kind of works good on small tubes and a little 5-watt amp. People try to make 15-watt or bigger single edit amp. There's no phase inverter in a single edit pure true class A amp. And to me, it's a very helpful regulator, but that's when you sort of it slows it down and processes it a little bit before it feeds a push-pull output section. When you have no phase inverter, like a Champ or whatever, and now you Neil Young it, you turn it up, you can just swamp the hell out of the mouth of that power tube, where it's just, it bends over, then comes back up.
Right.
That a phase inverter prevents that. But anyways, you see that was one of my main points I wanted to get to you about phase inverters. Now it's a different game when you have no master and you've got an old plexi and you're doing the full, Van Halen or Marsh or Hendrix diming it. That's an unusual arrangement to have an amp that wants to just literally be dimed with, it turns it into this very special cup of tea. And maybe we could get into somewhat of a discussion of looking back at Van Halen. I had a revisiting of the whole, even when he died, somewhat of looking at how he had affected me and what I did. And at that point, even I was adding very acts to my Implexador and stuff, which obviously comes from him and whatnot. But there's a few lessons in there that I kind of relearned looking back at his sound and all that. But
let's do it. Let's talk about it. I just want to hit a couple of just before we do that. There's a few folks that sent super chats here.
Sure.
And but that was your knowledge is so deep, man. It's just awesome. So let's just thank Darren here for the super chat, and he says that, and then we'll come back. I promise we'll come back to the EVH discussion, because it's very popular around these parts. So thanks again, Brian, for the purple head shell for your Implexador 50. It looks amazing, and everyone sees it wants it. That's awesome. You can see it on Instagram. Thanks for the super chat, Darren. I appreciate that. And I still have my old Implexador, and I love that thing. It's amazing. There's a guy here, looks like from Russia, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce his name, and I feel bad about that because he sent a super chat. But anyways, thank you very much. It's gone far enough back in the chat that I can't highlight it. But anyway, thank you from Russia. We appreciate that very much. And Bill says, great show, gentlemen. Can you go back to the 100K pot? In the mid comment, have a drink on me. Thank you, Bill. We really appreciate it. 100K, you were referencing that's a Dumble mid-range design, the 100K, and that kind of gets out of the way and lets a lot more gain through the amp, right?
Right. So, okay, it correlates, and maybe people could understand it better if you look at it like the tone knob on a guitar. Exact same arrangement. If you have, and this is what I pointed out before we got started about something I recognized about Van Halen's guitar with no tone knob on it, just a volume knob. So you don't eliminate any of the upper end harmonics, and you have nothing killing any highs. That's why it's an interesting mix, why it kind of works well to not have more than the one pickup, or to at least have no tone on if you have multiple pickups on all the pickups. But what you're doing with a tone knob in a guitar is latching onto the signal. The cap is feeding through the tone pot to ground, and it's a big 250K or a 500K in a guitar. So when you're all the way up, you're trying to eliminate the effect of grabbing that signal and letting it bleed off the ground through that cap. So that's what's happening exactly in the mid-range knob of an amp in the bass mid treble. It's grabbing, latching onto the main batch of signal and bleeding whatever. So a small cap bleeds upper end frequencies. As you get to be a bigger and bigger value cap, it carries more and more low end. So whatever amount of frequencies down to the low end that cap will let pass, it's going to bleed them right off the ground. So that's what I'm saying, like the Van Halen, when you remove that, you get some upper end harmonics that even when you're on 10 on the tone knob, you're still knocking it down a bit. And like a Esquire, right, with only one pickup, and it's got all the way back on the three-way with no EQ, or with no tone knob, right? Then you engage the tone knob, then you got the big jazz cap on the other position. But there you could hear that opening up in that very clear, bright. So where I ran into it, let me give you this little story. It was quite interesting. So when poor Eddie passed there, and I was reminiscing, and so the only like whammy guitar I had at the moment was with a tremolo on it was this all mahogany Strat with a 50s pickguard on it with these very clean stock Strat pickups on it. So and I played it through my little National amp that I got in the living room that I played through. But I used my what's his name? JHS, is it? Pedal, the AT pedal, which I like, that just turns it like into a JCM 800, whatever. But I just dimed the gain on that thing. And so starting with very little, but that stock 50s pickguard arrangement, like an old Strat, no tone knob right on the bridge position. So I'm playing there and then cranking the gain up. And all of a sudden I could hear what I never recognized earlier in my days. Now what I was going to say is, even like on that's what I'm saying, like a stock 50 Strat pickup arrangement. Now all the other positions you do click in the tone knob. Sure. And my point is, so if you have a bright, clear, no tone knob guitar, you can adjust your knobs in your pedal or your amp or whatever and whoa the upper end down to get it right. But now you click on and you invoke that cap to ground, and now it's too dull and dark. And that's what I'm saying, why you don't want both. You either want to go one way or the other so that your settings are right for both no tone knob and with the tone knob. But
sure.
So one little tiny bit, I know you're a big Van Halen aficionado, and I gotta say you do an amazing job of playing that stuff. You shred the heck out of that stuff incredibly well.
He's my hero.
But so I saw this thing, maybe you've seen it. It was something called like the American Experience. He did a show about 2014, 15, 16, where it was just him talking about his experience as a Holland or whatever, a Netherlander coming over here, and when he was young, what the American experience was. But anyways, he started playing that, and he had his 5150 head, and just a crowd, mostly ladies in the audience, whatever. But he starts doing his thing. Now, of course, you get a lot more harmonics when, and a lot of people are under the, kind of, his tapping thing was the main thing for a lot of people, which that part never as much, I was never as much into. I love the harmonics and the aggression and the rip and tear and all that angsty good stuff when I was in high school there when he came out. But he can, as you can do, I'm sure as well. But I would be amazed at how many places on the neck he would get a harmonic.
Yeah, sure.
But in my new looking back and listening to it with all my experience of years now, and so you can get a lot more than you get, say, on an acoustic or something, right, where there's just a few frets where they want to give you something. You crank the gain way up and you get a lot more. You remove that tone cap, And all of a sudden, there's even more. And now those extra in betweens, bing, bang, bang, boom, boom,
Right.
they start popping everywhere because it's letting through these upper harmonics that a tone knob. When you look at that Frankenstein guitar, he looks like a guy that was up at 3 a.m. doing some speedy drugs and just kind of wanted to get it back together again to play, right? Like we don't need that tone knob. We don't need those other pickups. I just need my rock and roll. And I had that kind of guitar. I had a beautiful about 79 or 80 when Charvel still had Strat headstocks. I had an awesome one that was a full, basically Van Halen guitar. It was before Floyd Rose as well. It just had the sort of stock pickup, but an unusual in that it was a black body, one pickup, one knob, but it had an ebony fingerboard with binding, and that was very rare. You don't find many, you won't see many in that era of a Charvel. So I had one of those when I was a kid, but I didn't recognize that this, no tone knob. And again, when you only have the one pickup, you just naturally set your amp up right for it. You don't think, well, I can't switch to something with the tone engaged and hear the difference in it. But that's one of the lessons. And as on your putting the switch on your King Royale on the tone knob, that happens in a Vox as well. The unusualness of a Vox is that on the non-Tapu stuff is that there was no tone knob in the preamp. You didn't get volume tone, you just got a volume only, and it lets a lot of upper harmonics. Not only does the Class A output section with no negative feedback cause lots more overtones and harmonics to exist, but not choking that upper end in the preamp also, it adds to like that Brian May kind of harmonic content in there.
Well, and Brian May's that's a great example too of a guy that, with
tons of harmonics.
The happy accident of the treble booster being a band-aid on the dark, non-top boost AC30, and here you get this amazing sound that he heard with Rory at first, and then he kind of appropriated.
Right. But there is a thing there that happens without the tone knob. Now, like I was telling you before we started, with an EF86 that are very bright and tinkly in the upper end, usually very microphonic.
Yeah.
That, like the tone knob, like I'm saying, the tones down that upper end just a little bit, to me, is very helpful. Where a 12AX7 doesn't need it near as much, but an EF86 to me, it's very helpful to have a tone knob and to whoa that at any setting on the tone knob to have that upper end toned down just a little bit. So sometimes you can get too much of a good thing, if you will.
It's a balance, right? I mean, all this stuff is a formula. That's what I've found over the years, and many times, like for example, old Celestians. I mean, that's what I love about old greenbacks is they just do a nice thing as far as, and even that. I most like, as far as a new greenback that Celestion offers, just the standard run-of-the-mill one. But there is something about the heritage version of that speaker. To me, it's a little creamier, and it can be a good thing if you're using a plexi, I find, because the thing that we're all that harmonic generation and stuff that's going on, they're 96 dB efficiency. So they chill out.
Right.
That you
drop it way down. That's half more than 3 dB is half power.
Exactly.
So G12H is twice as loud. They rate it sometimes at 97, 96, somewhere around there. But yeah, they drop it down. The greenback 10s, maybe we'll touch sometime. I never liked any of the 10s on the market for a long time, but those greenback 10s, and remember, there was no old greenback 10. This is a new creation. But
it's great, right? The new one.
Oh my God, it's
really nice.
Magical. I tell people it's like it's American when it's clean to medium, and it's more mid hollow. It's papery and woody, and sounds like an American 10. Second, you bang it hard or push it hard, it becomes mid focused, very British, and almost more Vox than Marshall. And to me, even though it's a ceramic magnet, it almost has compression like an Alnico. So
yeah, man,
I want to do a 410. I've done 2 10s, but I would like to even hear a 410 of those. I think would be really, really good.
Agree.
But I love them. Where I was just not at all happy with anything else in the market. So, and I just saw that I guess they make a H type or whatever, a cream one instead of the green one, and forgetting one other one. But somebody finally ordered one with those greenback 10s, and I'm like, wow, I'm like playing them, I'm like loving them more and more and more. But those are really, really good. But those, I'm gonna say, that drops you down to like 95 or so. And that's almost, I tell you, it's about makes a 30 watt, whatever you consider. So if you consider something, whatever, a 30-watt sound with a G12H or a vintage 30 or a blue that's 100 dB at 1 watt. You
Yeah.
knock it down to 95, it's like making a 30-watt amp sound like about a 10-watt amp. It's that
Yeah.
big of a difference
It's
just
a
with speakers.
We
And then
started
you
off
get
talking about speakers and what a huge impact, and I think it's another, just
10's a
defining
whole
that.
different world than 12's. The
Yeah.
nice thing too, because it's so quiet, you get to unleash your master a lot more to be
Exactly.
at the same level, and you
Yeah.
get some of that girth back of the smaller 10s, which naturally trim the deep bottom a bit. You get some of it back because you get the girth back in the power section of the amp by being turned up. So
Yeah.
somewhat with the greenback as well. They're not far off. Um, what I back to your point that you started with in that comment, and I think others like Germino and others agree. Same problem on both the Heritage, on the greenback and the G12H. The G12H, but well, it's all just state though. I like the regular version better than the Heritage version
The anniversary.
of both the H and the M.
Okay.
There is a more paper vintage quality when they're not pushed hard to both of the Heritage. There's something good in them. They all they say is glues, parts, and pieces. They found so I don't think it's a different cone,
Yeah.
different glues. Maybe the gluing the I don't know, but they don't exactly elaborate what the differences are. But I found it in particular on the H. So, and that was the other weird thing. Maybe you remember they made the 55 hertz originally, and it
Yeah.
was
The
4 or
Heritage
5 years, 6 years before I was begging them. Many other were begging them, but I was yelling at them like I was hoping the Heritage version, the H, was going to be my baby, and I'd be using the heck out of that.
Yeah.
And when it came, and then they finally did it, and then I heard it, it's like, ah. And at first I was enamored to get that paperiness, and there's a certain vintage quality to it that it does have,
Mm.
but there's maybe touch on this. There's a critical zone, and that's what I noticed when I looked at the A50. Very unusual between 1 and 2K. So people aren't familiar in a hi-fi arrangement when you got even a two-way woofer and a tweeter, 12-inch, 10-inch, 8-inch, whatever. They're very flat from wherever they roll off at the bottom, 60, 70, 80 hertz, on up to just past 1K. And when you have a crossover network, they chop it off and don't let that woofer cover anything above where it gets all squiggly wiggly. And they let the tweeter take over everything from 1K and above. In a full range speaker, anyways, if you look at any of the classic selections, a greenback, G12H, most of them, vintage 30, blues, any of them, the critical zone is 1 to 2K. From 80 to 1.2, they're very flat and even.
Mm.
From 2.2-ish or so to 2.2 to 5.5, where they roll off, they're very flat. Between 1 and 2, they do
It's
this
crazy.
big dip and then a spike to the moon. So you're running at 98, 99 dB, and it'll drop down at, it's roughly 1.2K that it drops down, but it varies 1.123, somewhere in there. But it'll go down to like 85 dB. I mean, monstrous dip.
Yeah.
And then shoot straight to the moon, where at 1.8, it's at 108, sometimes 110. That's, remember, 3 dB is twice as loud. So you got an exaggerated 1.8, a sucked out 1.2. Otherwise, much of the range is flat in the whole guitar range. That's the anomaly. And if you look at the A50, it's got a little wiggle in it, but it's much smoother. It doesn't do this sharp spike dip and then super sharp spike up. I mean, it goes down, goes straight up, and then comes straight back down.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, Brian, because it's like when I listen to that speaker, I remember thinking, this speaker sounds like a relaxed, like when pushed, it kind of does a greenbacky thing to me, but it's relaxed. It almost sounds like, for lack of a better, it's like a broken in. Oh, there's a nice quality to it that's not too accentuated in any.
Which one you talking about? Just to be clear, the Heritage A?
The A you're mentioning,
oh,
that it doesn't have that big spike. And I hear that it sounded quite like almost like it just does kind of what you want to do. It doesn't have like some radical, like strange spike around a very crucial frequency or something,
Right.
It sounds smooth and, like there's a smoothness to it when it's driven. That's how I remember Rick, the Celestian rep here in the States, saying, you're going to like it because it's got kind of it almost sounds like a rolled off greenback, like kind of when you push it, that it's got, with distortion, it's got a nice American smooth quality to it. But then it when pushed, it's got a Celestian character, but it's not like radical,
Right.
like everything crazy. So it
Well,
does have a really nice sound.
yeah, I'm anxious to try that 4 and like I say, anything that's good on a more American sound. I think just not having that super spike at 1.8
Mhm.
makes it relatively sound less mid-range, which
Yeah,
is more American. American speakers, everything, the amps, the speakers, everything lends itself to a more mid-scoop sound. And like I say,
sure.
without the mid knob, you can't fill that mid on most Fenders. But anyways,
Yeah.
but so they made the 55, and when I finally heard the 75, I was like, that must be why they made the 55 instead of the 75, was because they didn't like what that 75 was giving them. But it
I
was
don't
in
know. I
that.
mean, I was questioning maybe it was like a Hendrix thing. That guy, like I was because that was what he liked. Evidently, it was the bit. Maybe they thought, oh, we should do that like for an H because he was the
Well,
most
but
iconic
it's
user.
too veiled and too dark for my. It is a bass speaker, and it sounds like a bass speaker. You want, but what I was going to say was that this smoothing, and one other thing that does that is when you mix two speakers, which I like a lot as well, say in a 212 even, that if that dip and spike are in slightly different places, slightly offset, it has an averaging out effect to your ear overall. It's
Hmm.
good that they're more equal. If you do a greenback and an H or a greenback and a vintage 30 or something, to your ear, you're going to hear the one that's 100 dB way out in front of the one that's 96, 97. To the mic, it's fine. You can put whatever you want and mix and match. But to your ear, you're going to be mostly hearing the much more efficient one. But it
Yeah,
does smooth out that idiosyncratic 1 to 2K range. but
yeah.
but to fine point it, it was the 75 that, and I think it's on that spike part or something. The same region annoys me in the high wattage 75 watt like G12H creamback, and I
Hmm.
really don't like the 65 watt greenback.
Cream,
Whatever they call that
the
heritage
cream,
one.
right? I like the H, but the M I'm not that crazy about. It sounds like
The
a lot
H
of
is
mids.
fine in most region. It's just a few key places where it's a little funky. And again, and my ears are
Mhm.
really well tuned to G12H
Yeah,
for a lot of years, and greenback, whatever, and vintage 30s, all those. But um,
I know
the-
what you mean.
it, but I'm glad that the cheaper one works better. But I think even Germino had found that he liked the greenback regular better than the heritage. I think that's not an uncommon view.
Yeah, a lot
Um,
of people feel that way, I
yeah,
think.
and it's fine. The regular ones, and I will certainly tell you, though they've just now in the last year, two, three, gone back to making them in England.
Right.
There was never a problem. Mr. Top Hat here says of China making those speakers.
No.
I told people I used to get pallets of 60 speakers, and when they were made in England, I'd get three, four, five of them would be dented or problem or voice coil rubbing or something.
Right.
It came from China. Now I don't know if it was, coming from England to the East Coast and then going all the way across on a truck that was the problem rather than on the West Coast. You're getting them straight from China, but I had less problems and zero difference in sound. I tell
Yeah.
people the parent company of Celestion is KEF, which make really nice English hi-fi speakers. They're almost like studio monitors, like tannoys or something. They're very, very high end. And if
Yeah.
you can make a high-end driver a silly little guitar speaker, there's nothing to it.
Yeah.
It doesn't take any English expertise to
I'll tell
assemble
you,
a Celestion speaker there.
I visited their factory and they showed me how to make one, and I made one.
In England or in China? What are you talking about?
I made a 10-inch like in Ipswich. I went to
Okay.
the factory and they took that you can go on a factory tour and they'll let you make this. So I did all the
Ah,
glues and
yeah.
everything, and I put it together. And I was like, "Is this speaker going to work?" when I'm done? But it's not that complicated. It's
No,
really
that's what
not.
I'm saying. So there was
Yeah.
never a problem with the Chinese ones, and a little less on the defects. And
Yeah.
now they're back to England. Even for a long time in England, before they moved full production to China, they were already making many of the parts and pieces in China and sending them to be assembled. It was always the same parts and pieces. So,
There you go. Yeah.
but yeah,
Hey, we've got a bunch of questions, and I promised everybody that we would answer them. Maybe
sure.
we should do a few of those. Like, so I'm just going to take some questions here from the chat. YMESYDT says, "Why don't builders?" This is a really good question. I think. Why don't builders ever make super reverbs now? I see so many plexis, deluxes, channel switchers, but never super reverb, despite it being an iconic amp. And I agree, it's one of my favorites. I'm gonna guess it's the weight of the 410s and the whole. It's just one of the heavy. It's
Well,
like
if he's talking about the whole enchilada of a super reverb with the 410s as a combo, rather than maybe say theoretically a head or something that's giving you what a super reverb does.
yeah.
Um, for me, as I say when I started, number one to me, Fenders they're making them. I will make this point as well. I would say about boutique amps in general, on the very clean, almost jazzy clean, and to a certain respect, even a blackface clean. You don't have to spend a fortune. You can make them a little more glorious sounding. There's people who make them. I think mine are certainly improved versions on them, but it's not as necessary. And on the very dirty end of the spectrum, where it sounds like a pedal, you don't have to spend a ton of money on the super dirty or on the super clean. It's in the middle where point to point, few parts, all this comes into play and pans out. So number one, if you made a full super reverb, if I made a full super reverb with both channels, there is a lot of circuit, a lot of tubes, a lot of time to hand build a boutique version of a full super reverb.
Okay.
The 410's not a thing. If you, I mean, unfortunately, just more to me, more recently, there's some good 10s you could do it, but it would end up being it's 4 speakers. Those speakers cost basically almost what the 12s do. You now have in one unit a very expensive chassis and 4 speakers. It's almost the price of a 412.
Mm,
So that's going to be a very, very, very expensive amp. I made before I've stopped making it long ago. I occasionally make them special for people. My Ambassador, I made originally the 35 watt 46V6 Class A version because that was at least different than regular Fender. That you had this output section that once you cranked it up would finally saturate and become a little more Vox like or something else. But then I made a 50 watt 26L6 version and a 46L6, the 50 and the 100 watt version. That 50 watt was effectively my single channel version, elaborated single channel version of a super reverb. So I have made one. That model just never did that well. They're expensive again, even when they're stripped
yeah.
down to one channel, not two channels. But it's just would be, I'm telling you, it'd be at least a $4,000 amp, if not a $4,500 amp, if you wanted that whole thing hand
Interesting.
built and built in America with everything. So I think that's part of why. Um,
Yeah.
and I just
Could
think
be.
there's a number of things. Even I'm pretty sure Fender makes a regular reissue of that, don't they?
Fender does have a reissue of it, and they've even got their kind of like modeling light version of it now, which is
Uh,
the Tone Master, I think they call them, and it's a where they look. It's an interesting
right.
concept, those amps, where they're making a modeling amp it's a one sound modeling amp that looks like the originals, and I think it's done pretty well for them.
I've seen some version, one of the models of that, but
Yeah,
I think that's why it's a big elaborate amp that would just have a ton of hours in it and be expensive with 4 speakers and all. And you got to pick your fights, I will say, as a builder, that you can't
sure.
just make what, hey, I like super reverbs. Here's one, yes, and it's $4,000 or 4,500.
Yeah,
It's hard to sell them. Not many people have that much money to buy them. I've always tried to somewhat keep my prices as reasonable as I can, not
yeah.
to
You were
outlandish.
always really reasonable for the quality and the, that I never felt like your amps I mean, ordering a brand new, your list prices were like, this is not, I mean, you were less than
I
max.
was
This is not
behind,
even,
always behind. My brain stuck from my buying days
yeah,
that ended about in the 90s.
yeah,
And keeping up with inflation, everything I'm terrible at. I just recently had to bump them up with all the problems of today, whatever.
yeah,
But yeah,
yeah.
I don't like being just. I'm a guitar player. I don't have $4,500 every day to buy an amp with. So
You're
they
yeah,
are
I mean,
cool.
your Rialto, for example, I mean, taking a smaller amp that's a little more portable, little lower power, it seems like the trends towards less volume and like giving people a whole bunch of voicing options. I mean, it seems to be that's a little more like rather than a bigger, heavier one sound, louder,
Yeah, yeah, I would say
right?
that's a limitation, yes, in that there's no master on it. A master does very little help, even on my 50 and 100 watt Ambassador. You know, half to full was useful, but you would
Yeah,
never kill it below halfway on the master. So they're a little helpful. It's there's not that much
yeah.
gain in them. Um, I will tell you when I made one, what I did along with the stripping out and not having the tremolo and not having the simple extra channel. having the send and return and all that. But I did do it purposely with a 12AX7 rather than a 12AT.
Mm.
And whether you got way cranked up, and that's what I'm saying when you get into with no master, where 7 to 10, a fender falls apart and gets grindy. Mine, if you cranked it up or if you hit it with a pedal and you wanted to push it more into the Marshall-y rock zone, that 12AX7 would transition and let more power tube distortion happen when it was wanted. It would stay about up to halfway, very much like a Fender. But once you got it more aggressive by cranking it way up or by hitting it with a dirty pedal, it was happier to turn into that output section into a rock amp rather than fighting it. Leo's like Blackface was fighting with the phase inverter, with his output transformers, and even the speakers. He was not one, and you can't, to a certain extent, you can't get too dirty with reverb, as I'm sure you're aware. You get too much distortion and reverb, it's a big mess, and you can't articulate. So I understand why he was doing that, especially you get tremolo and reverb going. You need to articulate it. Next question, so I don't blab all day.
Green Mirror says that he just came off a little research on Tom Weber about his speakers, and would love to ask you if he if you knew him at all, or were if you've tried his speakers and you're aware of his.
Not Tom. What? That's not his first name, was it?
Weber, I believe it is. Yeah, isn't it?
Was that the son? The original guy, I don't think his name was Tom, but it's been a while, been 20 plus years. Yeah. So I don't want to disparage anybody too much. I used some of those in the late 90s. I had some of my own versions made. Here's what I'll tell you. It's somewhat correlates to even amp builders, where we have different fortes and different mindsets coming at it from a different place.
Mm-hmm.
The original guy of Weber, who I believe he has passed away since, and his son runs it now, but he was a literal General Motors engineer, and he looked at speakers in horsepower, torque, whatever, especially torque, whatever, but in very engineering sense.
Oh, it's Gerald, right? Gerald Weber, right? Is that
right about that? No, that's Kendrick.
Right. Sorry, I'm mixing up my Weber.
Yeah.
All right, sorry.
But I don't think it was. Maybe it was. It's been so long since I talked to him. Really, really nice guy. Loved him. He was a great guy, very friendly and helpful and all. He made a ton of different, models and all. But what I will say is, he said to me with his own mouth. So I'll just try to keep it that way, that he doesn't have an ear for music.
Okay.
He's not a player. He doesn't have musical ears. He's an engineer making a piece like it's an engine that's got torque and whatever. And he ran them. Part of the problem I ran into, he liked to get more torque by running very tight gap on the voice coil former. And I would get a lot of problems with voice coils rubbing because it's too tight in there, where you don't get near that problem and I just never saw the reason for running it so tight. To me, almost a little looser, being softer and sweeter rather than revved up quicker and more lively. But that was something he was after. But that was one of the main problems that I got tired of experiencing, was rubbing voice coils.
Yeah, do you find, like, I mean, we might draw a little parallel here with, like, because a lot of guitar tone, I think, is happy accident, like what I define as, like the way the original 412s came about, and they were 812s, and then, for Pete Townsend, they got cut in half and all that, and that's about how much thought was put into it. They sawed them in half and put the plywood on top, or whatever.
Those things are crazy. I had an 810 when I was a kid, and those were crazy big, even. But
crazy big and cool, but happy accident, and I think with Fender amp designs, I mean, a lot of them derive from the RCA, old manuals, and now what the differences that you're talking about here, I'm just going to draw the parallel here, is that we had a lot of folks designing stuff back in the day that weren't necessarily musicians or had an ear for music, right? And they were, thinking much more like methodically about, well, here's how you build this design, and then lo and behold, people use it to make rock and roll or whatever. But now you've got folks like yourself that really have an ear for, that's the difference, where it's like, okay, let's take what that was and now maybe make it a bit more versatile, work on 10, work on 5,
right.
Like,
and balance and blueprint them out a little bit more, and eliminate some of the deficiencies and that sort of thing. Yeah. Now it's true, Leo was not any of that, and he literally created the market of guitars and amps there, almost single-handedly to some degree. But what I was going to say is, and I've never heard the fine detail. You know, he had the other marketing guy, Fullerton, whatever, and all that. But you know that Leo wasn't just saying, "Okay, I'm not a player. Let's try different speakers, and whichever ones I like best, we'll go with that." You know, he's getting feedback from people who do play. Certainly,
Yeah.
Marshall did. Uh, and I think that would be another good discussion if we could maybe slip in. As Marshall progressed from the Twee basement and him, and
Yeah.
I relate to him even that he was a drummer.
Yeah.
I started as a drummer, and then he started building the amps, whatever. But and I got to say, I think, but here one quick note:
Yeah.
when you watch, there was a pretty good history of Marshall I saw on YouTube, and but that I didn't realize how flat out purposeful he was making a rock amp. That
Yeah.
those young British English guys, those art school kids that all became all the greats, they were with him very early. You know, he started putting out in 62 or 3, but even like 60, 61, whatever, he was already starting into some of that. But that he was wanting to make what was a pretty good rock and roll amp to begin with, a 59 Bassman, and but truly make it better for these upcoming what became the British and Pete and all these guys, whatever.
Yeah.
That it was purposely to make it a rock amp.
Yeah.
Where Leo made great rock things that turned out to be cool for making records and rock amps and distorting the holy hell out of them when they weren't as much necessarily designed. His genius and his goodness, I will say, always of Leo, but especially you see it even in the primordial Tweed years, is he had the mentality that you could plug a mic, an accordion, a guitar, or a bass into a champ to a twin. That they're just a general amplifier that's really good, and you can put
Mhm.
anything in there, and it's pretty darn good, but meant for broad spectrum amplification, not rock and roll purposeful distortion. So a little different the mindset. But you see what I'm saying? I don't think Lee he had to have some input of people with ears helping to make the choices and
You
speakers.
would think, right? It's
The
like,
other
how
thing
did
I
he?
will say is in those days, you almost couldn't pick wrong. That like you just went with Jensen, and those were great speakers, and you could pretty much pick anything in the line, and they're very good.
Well, okay, okay. So
Tubes
this
were
is the
amazing.
funny. This is the funny. I could just see these guys calling, like, I can see Jim Marshall, 1964. I need some more of those 12-inch. No, not those ones. Give me the cheap ones, the low watt. Well, that'll be fine. And now, the 20-watt greenback. It's like, it's this
Yeah.
magic.
Oh, you mean the
It's like,
L? Yeah. No.
yeah,
I there for a while they made those in the later 90s. It was the LM and the H, and the L had that tiny little magnet. And I tried some of those,
yeah,
and they're pretty weaselly, those little true 20 watts. Now they call
yeah.
the Heritage 25 a 20, but it's
Right, right.
not a 20. The 20 was the L, the 25 was the M, and the 30 was the H.
It was a very strange marketing decision to do that because there's nothing to
Right
confuse it,
now,
I think.
quick note on speaker history. Maybe some people don't know that we only got in a world permanent magnets in
Yeah,
like 47, 48 after World War II. Before that, you had to have a coil and charge up a coil to make a coil driven speaker rather than a permanent magnet causing the magnetic field for it. But that the blue Alnico was Celestion's first permanent magnet in like 47, 48. That
mm,
was it. And like pretty much all through the 50s until the early 60s, until you start getting the ceramic ones in 65, I think it is. Just that was, you want a speaker in England, you get
yeah,
a Celestion, it's going to be the blue. And they used the cheap ones without the pretty blue bells on them in the early Marshalls, whatever.
yeah.
But I will tell you, when I first started, I love real old blues, and it's unfortunate again. I hear nothing on the market today, even with all of scumbag stuff. Anything, anybody, Celestion got 4, whatever, up to the cream now, and I do like the
Mm.
cream as probably my favorite of the Celestions now because it's
The
got
Alnico, you mean?
the cream Alnico.
Yeah, nice speaker.
Yeah,
Yeah,
even though it goes against my low watt general religion of speakers, it's a very good sounding speaker.
agreed.
It's balanced. It's relatively darker to the very bright and yipey blue. I'm just not much of a fan of the blue, even though they improved it when they came out with the heritage speakers to me and got these blues parts and pieces. At least it did seem to help the blue from being quite so bright and harsh. But now they got the ruby I haven't even tried, and the gold I heard sounds like the old bad blue. But the cream is warmer, darker, fuller in the
Yes,
mid to lower end, and
yes.
not bright, which works well then with the L84s or anything that gets aggressive in the upper end. And they can take a lot of power and not sound like they're ready to explode.
It's a
But
good thing as a
nothing
builder.
I've heard sounds like what an old real blue does.
I know
Even
what
a
you mean. Yeah.
retoned old blue doesn't sound like a blue. Even the silver bulldogs of the 67, 8, 9 era sound much more greenback like to me than the
Mm,
our early real blue. When you hear a real early blue, that is a godlike speaker. That thing
yeah.
was out of this world. It was balanced, woody, papery, sweet, not harsh, not accentuated in the upper end.
Yep.
Full spectrum, no downside, good push, good clean, good everywhere. And that
Yeah.
does not exist today, unfortunately, in my opinion. There's lots of
Yeah.
choices and some good stuff, but nothing's like those old blues, unfortunately. I wish there were.
It's a funny, because the original AC30s are so expensive now. If you can find a copper panel, with the added top boost on the back and stuff. But I think a big part of why they sound so magic is those speakers. If you
Oh my
find one that's
God.
got, and that drives, and once again, coming back around to speakers are such a huge part of this whole thing. It's just such a huge part of the equation. There's some folks that corrected us here on our Tom and Ted and Gerald Weber. So Ted Weber is the speaker guy.
Yeah.
Tom Weber was EVH's guitar tech, and Gerald is the amp guy. There
All
we go.
right. I
Set
knew
the record
Tom
straight.
didn't sound right. Yeah,
I know.
Ted,
I was like, yeah, I can't, I forget. As it
not
considering
far
my
off,
age.
but he was a sweet, lovely, very, very nice guy. Um, and like I say, they make so many. I didn't try every single one of them, but I tried to make the best I could while I worked with them, and they were very good. They were a slight variation from a Celestian, as there are so many out there. I will say though, I've heard a lot of. I've tried many myself. I've tried even myself since I've started to find a company anywhere in the world that could make us a C12N type American speaker.
Mm-hmm.
There was the Nailer that he tried to call a C12N back in his day, if you remember him, and that was a
Yep.
very good sounding speaker, but it basically was sort of American, but still had the greenbackish kind of cone.
Yeah.
Was more of a Celestian still to me than it was a true American speaker. But I've tried that forever. But all these slight variations, whether Mojo makes them, the Austin speaker works, Warehouse guitar speaker.
Yeah.
Of all of them, I tend to like Scumbacks the most that are alternative versions. One guy did get an Austin speaker work, and I did like that. It sounded, and I could see where maybe some might like it, maybe even more than a Celestian. Generally sounded like a very good Celestian, but it was a little tighter and more under control. I forget
Mm-hmm.
exactly which model it was, but where I heard a number of Warehouse ones that I tried even myself, I didn't care for. But I've heard at least one good, and it was only the only one I've heard from Austin, and it was good. But what I was going to say is they're all slight variations of a Celestial, and then they're much more expensive. Where you
Yeah.
can
Right.
have the original, that's
Right.
to me works great and fine and dandy, and
Yeah.
uh, I would use something if it cost a lot more. I will say the old blues, like you're saying there, if there's ever a speaker to spend a lot of money on, would be old real JBLs
Mm.
and old blues. That again, there's nothing like those today. So
Yeah. Christopher's just mentioning he's loving the wisdom here. Thanks for sharing. He says he's listening carefully. Thanks, Christopher. There's a fellow that's asking, Michael Kraus is asking about suggestions for a speaker, maybe for a 62 reverb rocket. It's currently got a cheap pile in it. What would you think would be?
a Reverbo rocket, is that there's a couple different versions and tubes. I don't know which exact tubes he got there, the 75, 91s, 81s, whatever.
Yeah.
It's some 6L6 alternatives, and I think some of them had 6L6s, but I've had friends with old ones of those. Um, Depends if you want versatility and cleanup ability. So I'm a simple fella. I would put a G12H if I want versatility and variety out of it. To me, the advantage of an H, especially in an open back, is that it will turn down and clean up better than a greenback. Greenback is
Yeah.
best in a closed back to me when it finally gets tight enough that it will clean up better and articulate the front edge of the note better. The H in an open back with a much bigger magnet is much quicker in an open back environment, and it can rock and be turned down and clean up really well. That's especially with a Class A amp that can have a pretty broad range of nice, clean, stringy, clean to snarling dirty.
Mm-hmm.
I want it to be able to turn down and clean up. I don't like when it go to turn down and it's still creamy yellow rather than
Mm-hmm.
getting fully true cleaner. But if you like rock and roll and only rock and roll and sweetness and creaminess, it's hard to beat a greenback.
That's the
Especially with
thing.
a
When you want a
microphone.
greenback to be sparkle, it doesn't really, but well, it's great at the dirty. And then that's why we in my amps we'd gone to the, like an H creamback, the 75, because for a single speaker in a 112 or in the horizontal 212 we do, because I just feel like across the board it's the best. But could given my
For
brothers
a 100-watt amp, or for how much power of an amp you talking about?
well, that's the other thing. Yeah, in my so for the originally the Sir PT100, we did a horizontal 212, and we tried a bunch of different speakers, and I like blends and stuff like that. But in that, just 2H75, the creamback that you were saying you're not as crazy about, but I actually quite like it. From clean to dirty, I felt like this speaker kind of does it all pretty well. If in an optimum world, I would have maybe that for my clean, and then for the dirty, I like a greenback because of the woody thing that they do. But I felt like it was the best balanced overall, because I feel like with the clean channel suffers a little bit with greenback because it's that warmer, woodier, like you said, yellow creamy thing.
Right. What one note I would make, when you get more and more of a speaker, I don't know if you remember the old Bose hi-fi, they had like 9 little 4-inch drivers, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
When you gang them up, especially once you get to a 412, you expand, the bottom end goes deeper than one does, and the higher end you expand their frequency range when you gang them up. So you get the most in a 412 closed back is the home for a greenback.
Yeah.
That's a classic, beautiful, wonderful arrangement, and it will, at least with the tightness of the big closed back, ganging up 4 of them, you'll have at least some cleanness and good, better range.
Sure.
And that's their forte. 212, barely enough what you're talking about and describing there. So the other thing I would mention, so why I like lower wattage speakers, real low watts, rather than high watts, is once you get, so on a typical 12-inch, once you get past about 35-ish watts, maybe you could get 40 with a true paper voice coil former. But it's the former that gets to be a more modern material on speakers that can handle at 60, 75, 150, 200 watts. There might be some other newer one, but it used to be Nomex or Kapton were these other alternative voice coil former materials. And my sense of the Kapton, and that's where like a lot of the reissue P10Rs for basements and stuff would have Kapton and be a 30, 40 watt rather than a 15, 20 watt, whatever, little 10. But so it's that difference. And so when under duress, in particular, when you push them, so it's, there's a rod that the voice coil is grinding on there. Forgive my dirty picture there. But when it starts getting discombobulated, when it's under duress, you get some grinding going on, and it starts rubbing. On the inside, you're not rubbing the voice coil, you're just rubbing the former against the rod. Paper is very forgiving. It's literally like a toilet roll right on an old speaker. It's very simple. It's craft paper, but that's what helps be a more papery vocal sound. Nomex is like what they'll use in building a transformer and stuff, is insulative layers that's like a fiberglass mesh and some epoxy kind of stuff. Handles heat infinitely better, going to give you way bigger power handling. But imagine it's that voice coil that we're electrifying that's around this softer stuff that darkens it down. You instead of pring, you get prong, you get this different voice to it. And the Kapton is a more ceramic-y, brittle, harsh. And those, when you pushed them hard, would get this grinding. And so now this ceramic material grinding, you get this upper artifact in the upper end that is a really bad distortion. Stuff like a vintage 30 doesn't affect it to it. The Cream Alnico doesn't have much of a problem with this, but my point would be, say, even on the 75 Cream back that I don't like as much, that little difference in that certain part of the vocal 1 to 2K range, it's what I know, it's that former that's bugging me, that it's not that simple.
Former. I hear you, man. I mean, I remember trying this with the Scumbacks and getting one of the PVC versions. and Jim telling me, listen, this speaker will catch on fire if you push it too hard. But man, do they sound good. It was just like that paper voice coil was like, and I know exactly, you just described it perfectly with the sound of the however
Yeah,
you
when they're under
articulated.
duress is when things are critical, and that's when you don't want these bad things happening.
Yeah.
Either just an odd voice throughout or an upper end extra distortion that's just not good. That's why I lean towards paper voice coil former real lower wattage speakers, and
Yeah.
better to run a 50 watt through two 25, 30 watt speakers rather than one, to me, 175 watts. If you can,
Right.
when you got to have the 112, then you're forced into making choices, and what's the least negative choice you can make.
There you go. And you get a really nice there's another thing that happens that I learned from a friend of mine many, many years ago, that when it's like, when you're running like say a 412 or 412s like Steve Stevens would, or like with the, you can turn the bass down on the amp, because it's exactly what you said. When you couple four of them, now it develops, the bass goes lower, and the cabinet itself develops low, and you can actually, like, it's a recipe, but you can tighten up the amp and stuff by turning the bass down on a plexi, and you get that
Right.
beautiful, the more speakers you have, the more you get bass out of the speakers, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I see his question here. I'm trying to think if he's talking about the later, like late 60s, 70s kind of squareback, or is that a new squareback eminence?
Old,
The
yeah. It sounds like he's saying the old. I'm not familiar with those. So
In general, there might be some old eminence that are okay. I'm an opinionated guy, and I'll just tell it straight, as simple as I can. There's pretty much no eminence I've ever heard that I'd like. I heard the what's the guy that makes super expensive cords and stuff, that he has his own model of 40 watt. What's his name?
you're talking about Tomo, the great
Uh,
guitar player with an
no,
eminence.
no. There's
Oh,
he even made amps, whatever. But he
oh.
had these like silver guitar cords that were crazy expensive. Anyways, he has a signature model that a friend of mine thought sounded good, and it was probably the best one I had heard of theirs. But like their Red Fang, no thank you. In the old days, they were a little different. Some of those in like super reverbs and stuff. By the I don't know all of them, but by around 66, 7, 8 in there, you literally was a few still Jensens. They had Utahs, they had CTS, and I think they started getting into Eminence as well. They were using a lot of different stuff. So you
Mm.
see a lot of different ones in old amps. I will say the old CTS Alnicos, strangely in the later, not as great amp wise, but 68 to 71 super reverbs that have
Yeah,
those
yeah,
10-inch CTS Alnicos, those are super amazingly sweet, good
yeah.
bottom end. I love that old, even as late as I don't know if they went much past that, but those are a great old speaker. But Eminence, you're talking to a guy who is not a fan. I will tell you this anecdote. When I first started, I went to them. I'm like, I want, they're an American company. And even one of the main efforts was the C12N. All right, let's try to make, because that doesn't seem like a very difficult speaker to make, but it has proven elusive, and I have not found somebody that could make one. But
Mm.
in those days, so we're talking about 94, 5, 6, somewhere in there. And I was talking to the guy there, and I'm like, you could pick all the parts and pieces off of their list of stuff they've got. And if you bought 100 at the time, they would be like $15 a piece or something. Like, okay, can we make like a $40 speaker? Can we make a nice, let's make a really nice, good one.
Right.
Nope, you can pick whatever you want. It's going to be $15. This is the mentality. There was no desire to make a better. Later, they made, they got other
Mm.
lines. They're trying to historic reissue stuff, and the whatever. They're both the British or the Americans. Just not a fan of theirs. I will say another one that I have a difference. I have a friend of mine. He lived in California there, and he makes some stuff. I won't mention his name, but he likes the tone tubbies.
Mm.
And I will say there may be some new magical tone tubby that I have not heard.
Mm-hmm.
But again, Mr. Traditional Capricorn here. There was, as much as I like Mother Nature's green herb all my life, I'm a big fan. But there was never a hemp cone in the world of speakers in the old days, and it makes an odd sound. One
I know
guy
what you
came
mean.
in early 2000s, whatever, and he had a King Royale, and he came in and he put two of those red tone tubby hemp cone Alnicos in there. And I forget what his complaint, if something was wrong or whatever, but I take it in my sound room there in Fullerton, Anaheim border there, plug it in, and I'm like, dear Lord, what is wrong with this thing? And it like, this is how it felt. It felt like the brakes were on, like, it wouldn't breathe. There was no bottom end, there was no top end. It was all mid range, and it got the brakes on in the mid range. It would, I'm like, and I finally like, wait a minute, unplugged the internal 212, and I had a cab in there with two like G12Hs. I plug it in, like, pring, oh, there's my amp. Like,
Yeah,
it was so far, I couldn't
You
even
know,
play it.
I got to make a point because it's like I remember like hanging with you and you taught me things, so much stuff back in the day when I come by your shop. But what I loved about it was you used your ears, you listened, and this is one of those examples where a lot of people read on the internet, or especially these days, look at whatever it says on paper, but you would always listen. And so there, all the rage back in the day, at least in the late 90s, early 2000s, everybody was talking about Wing C EL34s, and I just got my Implexador, bought it used. For folks out there that don't know, I still have this Implexador top head amp that I found at Guitar Center Sherman Oaks, and it had a faulty input jack, so it was intermittent. And I used that as a, hey, look, I think this amp's broken. Will you guys give me a deal? And I picked it up for about $750, and then I brought it to you, and you're like, what? That's a great deal. And I'm like, well, it just needs the input jack, and it had been corroded or something. You fixed it, and then it was great. But anyways, I was getting you to retube it. I think probably around then, probably when I brought it in. And I said, everybody's talking about these Wing C EL34s are supposed to be, the original ones, the original Svetlana EL34s, and everybody's saying how great they were. And you're like, yeah, not really my favorite. And you're like, I like the EHs for new ones. And I was like, really? Those are cheaper. And like, you're like, well, let's listen. And you found two pairs that were perfectly matched, and you popped them in. You go, yeah, I don't like the, how they, when they go into distortion, the Wing Cs. And sure enough, we just turned it up and played. And I was like, oh yeah. the EHs sound better, and so for that was,
Yeah, I would make the differential between, there are some guys, some companies where they're true blue engineers, right? They're true audios, or maybe, or even at least electrical or electronic engineers.
Yeah.
And so what do? They put their trust in the scope as a big main thing.
Right.
They're going to plug in the amp, put the tone generator into it, and look at how it is on the scope. Let's see when it distorts. We turn it up, and let's look at how it distorts.
Right.
How does it play? How does it feel? How does when you do that? What does it give you?
Yeah.
I don't care what it looks like on your stupid scope. It has no meaning whatsoever.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? They're looking for perfection or their end result in a very different way. I just had a friend who has a whole bunch of my amps, and he's I think 62 now, and he said that the EL84s we're starting to grade on them, right, compared to the bigger other tube stuff. And I get that a little more myself. I'm 58 going on 59. But I just gave him the simple tip that, and this is what is natural to me, where others get very used to doing things the way they do it. But amongst tube changes, he had a bunch of NOS tubes. He's a big NOS guy. And part of, like I say, NOS, they're better quality. They're usually way more 3D. They last a lot longer. The guts are way better materials than they have today. Better in a lot of ways, but not always going to give you a sweeter, better overall sound. And even if they're the best old ones. But anyways, along with some change that first tube that would soften it up and maybe change the power tubes and whatever. But I made the simple thing that turn the cut up some more and turn that treble down.
Right.
To get rid of that upper end grind that EL84s do get. Again, I made this even when I told him it's a dot boost. It's got a lot of upper end grind and crunch in there.
Yeah.
And along with, he was trying something different, but he said, problem solved. Like, he just turned the cut up and the treble down, and that grind is gone. And but you have to, that's what I'm saying with that EQ adjustment when you're way choked down on the master.
Yeah.
You can hear it's all mid and upper end, and there's no bottom end. You got to woe the mid a little and the treble way down to match what little bit of low end's making its way through there.
Because you're actually changing the circuit in essence with that master.
Well, that's the reason. But my point is, your ears are telling you it's too bright and thin, and I need to woe that down to match what little low end I've got. So it's to me, it's common sense. But I always let your ears. I even tell people with NOS, it's weird that you can have a primetime Telefunken, a Amperix Bugle Boy, and a primetime Mullard tube, and just rearranging those 3 tubes in a 3-tube preamp amp, it'll sound very different just moving those around. But and I used to work with a lot of guys like you and other studio guys, and some would blow my mind what they would listen to. They'd come in and turn it up, and they got their guitar in 2, and they're doing their little strings right by the bridge, and they're going tink, tink, and I'm like, what are you doing? But they're looking for these harmonics in these very subtle little places, but they're definitely using their ears and know these special little spots where they're looking for this extra magic or to fix some too bright or whatever. But different people, I'm a little more Pete Townsend Kerrang and make that thing explode. Again, under duress, I'm going to see if things are distorting well, if the speaker's right.
And that's what we did with the 34s that day. We're really pushing the 50-watt amp. I mean, we would listen to it good and loud. And I was like, oh, yeah. I mean, they're way creamier. They just got sweeter. The other ones were just a little weird, the tubes. But you showed
in general, Russians are sweeter and creamier, not as articulate. I remember those days that Wing C was a little just harsher in the upper end, a little brasher. Not bad. It's still Russian, but wasn't quite as sweet. And I like the Muller reissues, which I think is a improved EH. I think is very not far off from the that used to be the line was the EH, and then once they bought the names to Tungsol and Mullard and all this stuff, I think some were they moved the EH over to the better names and maybe did a little tiny something better to them. But I think the same with the Tungsol. I think is a 12AX7 is a slightly improved EH. And I think the Russians are good at the mid plate. Their early stuff was short plate. The WA, WB, WXT pluses, all those were short plates, and they're okay, but a little more boxed in and not as much sound field and clarity. Right. But they're good at the mid. When they went to those LP and LPSs, they never hit it to me. And even the new Mullard, for a short while, I was enamored with it, but I don't know if they fixed it. But I got to say, those Mullard 12AX7s, they are a humongous elephant. They shouldn't even be called a 12AX7. I mean, they're like so big an elephant, bigger than any NOS I've ever heard in my life by a long shot. They really cranked that baby up. But again, to me, they missed the mark on it, and that's a tall plate. In my opinion, the Russians have yet to get down the tall plate. Their mid plate is beautiful. Like I say, my amps, I'm not looking for every bit of gain out of them. It doesn't make that great big. It's more of a tonal difference than even a gain difference.
Have you tried the EH 7025?
Is that new, or was that around before all the Tungsol and Mullard stuff?
No, kind of new, last year or two. The EH 7025s, they're a little low gained, but they sound really nice. Nice.
I would try those. Like I say, I lean that way. Back to one other note. So back to the tubes and today's tubes you asked earlier. So apparently, I only found out 6 months or whatever after it happened, but something happened to the factory in China that blew up, or they shut it down, or they did something, but it's out of biz.
Right.
And I had thought there was more. I always heard of that Wang Gang, whatever it was in China. I guess there was only one main factory making all these guitar tubes.
Yeah.
It went down, so they're not in production. But I think the German company Tube Amp Doctor does a pretty good job. I think a lot of his stuff, especially preamp tubes, he's just relabeling JJs and
well, a lot of those are Chinese, and that's the gray area where I don't understand, because he's still got, although it seems like he's kind of limited on what he's got, but they would have their kind of like exclusive RCA black plate style 6L6 and stuff, and those were all coming out of, as far as I know, the same place, the same factory.
But, so this is what I want to get to. So I don't think he does anything to the preamp tubes. Like I say, he does China, he does Russia, he does the Czech JJ, he does. He just, I think, relabels those and puts those out, and you can get a bunch of different stuff there. But on the power tubes, his 6L6 is both his WGC and the taller GC love both of those. My original tube on my Vanderbilt 33 was the short bottle or mid bottle. It is a side firing RCA black plate replica, and that's a great tube. More my style because it's more rock and roll than the tall bottle. Tall bottle is still good, and I think the best of those. But a lot of, to me, I would say the characterization I'd give Chinese tubes, they're thinner, more two-dimensional, tend to be brighter. In the power tube, that clarity is good. That's what I like, but those aren't terribly bright or thin on those power tubes. They're 6v6. I think it's also black plate-ish, whatever. I love those, and unfortunately, those have become very hard to find right now because the factory's down. But 6V, 6L6s, didn't use the 34s, and then they're 84s. And part of what I saw with him is, and I think at least, I'm not perfectly clear, I don't know officially, but it seems like on some of his power tubes, he did his slight tweaks of his own at the Chinese factory.
Right.
No, he had an EL84, and I had tried it, and it was okay. I wasn't that impressed. Then he came out with a new one, and I was greatly impressed at the improvement from one to the other. That led me to believe someone there, whether it's the main guy or whatever, but somebody's got ears that they heard a great improvement. And that's also part of why I started. And then I started doing the 6Vs and the 6Ls. I don't do much 6Ls. I still like the Muller reissue EL34. I will tell you, sadly, the Russian, their gold lion stuff, which I think is even supposed to be, higher than the Muller, but I swear I must have tried 4 or 5 sets of, had them send me samples of the EL84 gold lion. Every set failed. I don't know why. And then they're, more expensive, whatever. I don't know if those might have, and they have a 6CA7, which might be okay if it works, but the EL84s gave me such a bad taste. I didn't go much further down that road. But but I swear that Muller 12AX7, at first I didn't recognize, I like them. They're warm and they're full and they're big, but eventually I started going back to the tongue saw and saw, oh my God, what a difference in output. And they just weren't, they're just way too big and elephanty. Maybe for some certain application they might be right, but
those tongue saws are bright and clear.
That's once in a while, my Amplexador's in the first position. I might occasionally put a Chinese 12AX7 just in the first spot. When you want an extra ballsy
rock drive,
a little brighter, crunchier gain on that front end there.
Yeah. I like those much. I prefer those. If they're tested and they're low noise, the Chinese 12AX7s in a rock amp to me sound right. I mean, the tongue saws are nice, but to me, Fender Voxy, something like
yeah, they're definitely mellower and creamier than those clear, edgier. There's a lot of amps made for the Chinese 12X, and they got 2-3 different ones. But one other note I make. But if you got a question, what do we got here? The G12T75.
Yeah, this fellow's looking for a Clapton thing in a 212, so Marshall's, I guess lead circuit 10
watt 212.
Yeah, I mean, I would go greenback if I was in.
I would come way down off that big old 75, and that T75 is a way dark speaker. So we could maybe quickly note there the progression of Marshalls, right? So the very first ones had the Alnicos. That didn't last long. By 65, they're into the greenback, and then by checkerboard 70s, you're into the G12H era. When they got to the JMP, JCM 800 type with more gain and extra gain stage, they were very tight. I would even maybe quickly like to note my views of the 67-8-9 progression of the prime time of Plexi, but generally over time, once they got very bright, tight, and crunchy into the JCM 800 type of sound, they went to the 65s and then the 75 watt like that T. You're now a very bright, lean, crunchy amp, very upper end aggressive, and those are a dark, chunky speaker, very mellow in the upper end and full and chunky in the bottom. And they're to put a Band-Aid on the overly bright, crunchy amp and give it some bottom end fullness. That's what those speakers do. The 65s are probably my favorite of those higher wattage ones. The original, I think it's a T65, which I think they reissued. It's not great, but amongst those, if I had to have any of those, I would take the 65. But For a 10 watt, again, like if you only wanted to break up, well, and it's in a 212 too. Two
Greenback.
greenbacks is certainly enough. You want versatility. I will say this: my other favorite uber most versatile combo is a vintage 30 and a G12H in a 212, open or closed. What it gets you, what the vintage 30 gets you, where in and of itself, I don't like near as much as a G12H, but it's more mid-scooped by nature. This allows fender to happen. A vintage 30 is better once you get some power section, moving the cone. Once you get it woofing with some power, it rounds out. It becomes much more smoother and rounder in the bottom end. But I suggest in a Baltic Birch 212, you can plug in a Vox AC30. It's going to sound like a Vox AC30. You can the impressive part is you could plug in your super reverb and it'll sound still like a good Fender. It won't try to marshalize it too much. It'll let it sound like a Fender. And of course, it's happy with a Marshall. Marshall and Vox, both British. That makes sense. The hard part is the American sound.
Yeah.
But you can put it's so neutral that it just lets the amp come through with whatever it wants to be and whatever it is. So I highly recommend that if you want, and it also, the vintage 30 lets you get up into the 90s on upward, the more modern distortion. It's a very classic modern sound. The vintage 30 is widely used. So it helps you go into a more modern, higher gain rock distortion with one vintage 30 in that G12. Two G12Hs is great, but it's more articulate, cleans up, but still very vintage. Greenback, only vintage, only Marshall. You put a deluxe reverb through a greenback, and it's trying its best to make it into a Marshall, which it has none of. But it's trying, baby. It's breaking up, and it's doing its best. But that's not what you want. It's the worst speaker in the world for a deluxe reverb. Where, like I say, you can put an H, good. Vintage 30 sounds very good in a deluxe reverb. But that's what I'm saying. It'll let, even though it's a Celestion, it will let an American sound through much better than the true vintage ones do. So
Richard,
2Hs, two greenbacks, a vintage 30 G12H, any of those would work very well in that.
Richard here is saying for hard rock and metal, what do we think of mixing a Creamback 65 and a V30 and a Marshall 1936 212? The V30, I'm not a huge fan of that 65 Creamback, but I would
the 65 watt M, is that green or cream?
The 65 watt Creamback is their kind of greenbacky version of a. I think it was really kind of Celestion's answer to the M75 from Scumbag, because when they came out with the Creambacks, you had Scumbag coming out with the his M, his H and his M version, but a higher power. And I think the Creamback 65, it has this, you were talking about earlier, that particular speaker has a very mid-rangey sound to me that I'm not crazy about.
Yeah, I don't know what else, but it's just, it turns me off. But that's a G12M 65, right?
Correct.
And but those, to be clear, that's cream or green. I was thinking maybe they were green. Anyways, yeah, I don't like that speaker. If you did nothing, especially for hard rock, Greenback is more creamy, Clapton, 60s kind of creamy breakup. For harder rock, you want it more articulate. Just replace that 65 with a G12H, and you'll be a much, much happier camper there. And leave the vintage 30. I would.
Yeah, V12. Like some kind of like either an H75 Creamback mix, or like you say, the anniversary would probably be better for hard rock. The main problem I have in a 212, although we do it in my 212, which is an offset like those old Marshall style 212s. For my PT15, we have a cabinet, and the greenback is up here, and so we do a V30 and a greenback, and the greenback's in the top, the V30's in the bottom, and that's great because it's 97 dB efficiency as opposed to 99 for the V30 down here.
The one up closer to your ears, the creamier one, definitely. That's
in a little lower volume, and that works. If you do in a 1936 where they're side by side, to me, I always hear it as the V30 dominating because it's 2 dB louder, and
or 3 or 4, whatever. Yeah, that's a lot more efficient. Right. Yeah, it's way louder. You're going to way hear that. Probably still even in the 65 watt version. But yeah, I've done a straight 412 with 2 greenbacks and 2 G12Hs. So you have one of each on top. And then that is a big enough wide array that they mix together reasonably well that way. But in a 212, I would definitely do what you do. Put the creamier, softer one on top and the more articulate one down.
If it's that one, yeah. And then to me, the side, to be honest, like the side by side thing, and I know you've done it in your amps and stuff, but for me, whenever I try that thing happens where I hear the one dominating more, and I just never, and then I'll put two of the same speakers in there, two V30s, two G12H creambacks, whatever, and I'm like, that sounds great. That's better. I just hear it better. I don't mind the blends if the speakers are like this, or if it's a 412.
I got you. Yeah, because one's hitting your ear more when it's raised above the other.
It just works.
No, that makes sense.
But yeah, that's what I've found. You know, at least somebody's mentioned that they dig the Scorpion speakers from Peavey when they were made in the States, and I gotta say, I remember. I mean, that's the Tom Morello cabinet. You know, he did his whole career basically, all of Rage Against the Machine and Audio Slave on a Peavey with the originals, probably 75 watt Scorpions or whatever they were. I had one of those cabinets in the 90s. I agree, they were pretty good. I don't remember that cabinet as not sounding good. It sounded pretty good. I think Peavey probably made some pretty good drivers back in the day. You know,
I don't know who made them, if they made them themselves. I remember at one point they made their own capacitors, if you can believe that. That's amazing.
They kind of made everything, as I remember, but yeah, they did a lot back in the
vertically aligned or whatever you call company, where you're making everything as much as you can anyways. But you know, you're building a lot of amps when you start making your own capacitors. I'll tell you that.
Right?
That's a big company.
I'm really honest to be honest to God with the you know, the problems these days with supply chain and stuff like that. It seems like there's folks want to, you know, nice boutique amps. They like American made is still a thing and all this kind of stuff. I don't know what's involved in making something like a cap or a resistor, but my point is, it would seem like there's maybe a market for like, hey, all American made caps and resistors and parts, and that they could be selling to all these folks that are selling $4,000 amplifiers, but I don't know.
Yeah, Zoso makes special caps. I'm not, you know, caps make a definite difference. I've used slightly different ones over the years, but we could get into that. But definitely the medium of the cap. The old standard was polyester film foil. Metallized capacitors in the modern day, they sound more metallized. I'll tell you where I notice it the most, in the bypass cap that makes, you know, the bright channel of a Marshall, you know, the bright compared to the big fat doggy channel. That 0047 cap that's on there. So you're forced, you know, that's the alternative path around the resistance of the pot. And when you force a bunch to go through that one single cap, you get a very good read on what it sounds like. And unlike when I've heard my early Implexadors that had a metallized polyester 0047 compared to where now I have a polyester film foil, I hear the harshness of that one single cap. I can hear it when you've got the bright boost on anyways. That I tell people, it's in the name, just like even metal film. You know, like I've always used carbon film, which are noisier, but they're so much warmer and sweeter. Carbon film's the happy medium. That's what mostly Marshall used in the old days. He didn't use, whereas Fender used the regular carbon comp. But metal film are quieter. And again, see, this is where the engineer is going to go metal film all day long. They're like 1% tolerance. They're way quiet. Woo! Go for it. What does it sound like? It sounds like metal. Doesn't sound like wood. I tell you, imagine a tennis racket made out of metal versus carbon, and ding ding, you knock that tennis racket. When it's metal, you get that bright, harsh metal harmonic, whereas toot toot, you're going to be duller, and on carbon, it's just not going to be as harsh. But there is more noise, so there's give and take.
They can go bad, right? Too.
What's that?
They can go bad too, right? Over time, the carbon comp, can't they get squirrely over time?
You could theoretically overcome that by running higher, like running 1 watt resistors instead of half watt. If that was, I don't particularly buy that. When you have worked on, you know, Fender tweed amps that are 50, 60 plus years old, now they might stray a little more. In the old days, they used to make 20%. The modern day 10 is the furthest off, but you get a 5%. I don't find any big issue with that. Certainly not within 20 or 30 years. I don't even think 40 or 50. I think that's neither here nor there. But different caps definitely sound different, but that's a clear point of where what an engineer would pick over somebody that's want their ears to be pleased rather than just low noise floor and quiet and whatever. So I see, what's this? The guy making these pedals now. He takes great pictures. It's on my Instagram feed. I guess it's like, is it R to R, something like that? But is he the high watt guy or something? He does this immaculate, straight linear stuff like the old high watt amps and these little pedals. I mean, it is,
Oh,
wow, you've done a immensely beautiful job. But all metal film, a little tiny bit less critical in a pedal than especially you're going to amplify all that comes out of that pedal. Being a little less noise in the pedal is not as bad as doing it and ruining the tone of the amp. But
yeah.
it's where there's a guy who wants the most premium, best rated part, and it is, and boy, he does a beautiful job. But like guys, I've seen shootouts of guys doing old fuzzes and whatever, not many parts, and certainly the OC44, whatever, the actual transistor makes a big old difference, but the other parts and pieces do as well. And it's amazing how different, with again, not many parts in a simple fuzz pedal,
Sure.
that the components are going to make. That's where you can hear it.
Yeah.
And I always say, let your ears be the judge, but I don't
Sure.
go for the things that necessarily look best on paper. That's what I'm saying. Even modern capacitors, engineering spec wise, are way better than the old ones, but they don't sound nearly as good.
Yeah, you got to use your ears at the end of the day, and
GK85.
always use your ears. But this fella's just asking here. I've got about another. Let's see, it's 126. I've got to split in about 10 minutes, but let's take a few more questions real quick here. This has been amazing.
I'm
By
not
the way,
sure about that model. It goes against my general low watt desire. If
right?
it's an 85 watt,
I was hoping you'd say that because I don't have a great perspective on that either. The 85 watt. Some people talk about
I'm
it.
not, and that's a weird GK85.
Yeah.
If you're super dirty, I will just say again, a lot of things become less critical when you're in a very high gain. It's when you're in that vintage realm that it makes the most difference. But there's, even amongst higher wattage, I would go with something other than that. Like your G12H75 would definitely be better than that thing.
Yeah, I think they got
But
better.
you
By the
need
way,
it in a
even the new,
112.
I gotta recommend the new the Redback 150 watt speaker. They seem, evidently from what I've been told by people using a lot of them, for a combo and for like they're kind of on the dark side, but it's a nice speaker. It's greenbacky and 150 watts, and you can stick them in a combo, and they seem to be
Interesting.
yeah, it's kind of dark. They're on the dark, as you would expect, maybe 150 watt speaker. They tend to get darker the more powered. But once you get past the H, the 30 watt H, and then you get up to the 65s and 75s and stuff, and they always seem to get dark. But do you remember what speaker you put in Jack Sherman's?
Yeah, old Jack passed away, unfortunately. He was quite an interesting character. Did you know him?
A little bit.
Yeah.
I did, yeah.
I'm trying to remember which oversized. Now, I made my 112s bigger in 05 when I came out with the Supreme 16 and the Vanderbilt.
I remember that when you went from a smaller, even in the Club Royale. And
the combo's right. Got 3 inches wider and from 9 1/4 to 11 inches deep. I was trying to make the 112 sound closer to what you get out of a 212, and it makes a big difference.
Big difference.
In a 112, to try to get depth and bottom end and clarity, some volumetric efficiency of some decent size. You get a tiny little teal cab or whatever. I definitely don't like 14-inch deep little cubes. I don't like what that did.
I gotta say, your Club Royale. I mean, I remember I've got friends that gigged with those, and I had the King Royale because it's louder, and it was the standard, sort of AC30 depth, what you would expect.
Right.
But your Club Royale, when you went to the deeper cabinet, and we're talking about a 15 watt amp or something like that, and man, that amp if you guys want to hear, if you can find one out there, one of those, your original Club Royale that had the deeper cabinet, that amp was a great club amp and sounded. You're talking about an amp, once again, the AC30 circuit is not a hell of a lot of low end. There's not much going on below 500 hertz, right? So you get the more low end out of that cabinet, that the way that you did that deep cabinet.
Right.
Man, did it sound good. What a
You
great.
don't want too deep like a bass, but you definitely lose bottom if you're at 9 or 10. And depending how far the baffles set in and everything of your actual depth of the cab you're getting.
Yeah.
What else do we got here? So I don't remember exactly what, but he usually went with what I liked. It was probably a G12H. I'm trying to remember. Oh, it was an Inflectador cabinet, 112. Interesting. Probably in those days, probably would have been a vintage 30 as the higher watt alternative to handle a 112 Inflectador. For a long time, that would be my go-to. In the more recent days, they got these 75 watt H as the other option there.
Let's see here. So somebody's asking, this is a unique time for me to be doing this because I've got to travel tomorrow, actually. So somebody was saying, does the stream come on every Saturday? No, it's usually Sunday, and I'll be back after this week. Not doing it tomorrow morning. This was my stream for this week, and I'll be back to the regular scheduled time, Sunday mornings, next week. But yeah, tomorrow there'll be no. So it's generally speaking is 11:30, loosely, as folks that watch me know, 11:30, 11:35, 11:40 a.m. on Sundays, every Sunday now for 192 weeks.
Wow.
So, I know it's bonkers. Let's see here. What's the difference between Steven's asking a G12H30 Heritage and 70th anniversary? Well, you've tried both those. First of all, the Heritage, they came out with a 55 hertz bass cone version. So those are out there. So that was very different because it kind of shifts the frequency of the speaker and makes it more of a bass thing.
Speaker.
But they did do a 75, a lead cone version of that speaker for a little while too. And I don't know.
And like I said, they don't specify exactly what the difference. They say original blues parts and pieces. That's all they say.
Yeah.
They're close. And like I say, when you're not pushing it hard, there is papery vintage improvement on the Heritage. It's when it's pushed into distortion in just a certain little zone. It gets an ugliness up in the upper mids that I don't like as much as the regular one. That's basically it. The 55 is kind of like a 75 watt, a G12T 78, much darker. If you had a very bright, lean, crunchy amp, that's not a bad choice. But if you've got a balanced amp, you don't want that dark bass speaker, in my view.
Your opinion on Neo in general, maybe, but
I have not heard the Neo Creamback. The first many Neos I heard and tried, even Celestians. To me, I think it might have a better place in a microphone, but it cuts weight down if all you care about, boy, look at how light my cabinet is. Maybe you want a Neo. But I find it's harsher in general. It's just a harsh magnet sound. Like on pickups, there's Alnico 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Ceramic, there's all different kinds, and some are harsher than others. Yeah. That to me seems like a harsh magnet. I have little experience with them. The lightness is nice, but I wouldn't go for them. The Creamback might help that it's trying to be a creamier, low watt thing.
You should give that a try and tell me what you think. Try one, because I was actually quite surprised with that particular Neo. The Creamback, it was like next to a regular. I don't know if I'm crazy or not, but I tried them at Celestion in identical cabinets, and I was switching between a Creamback 65, a regular Greenback, and the Neo Creamback, which is supposed to be, it gets confusing with the nomenclature, but it was supposed to be their Greenback version of a Neo, right? And so the Neo Creamback this fellow's asking about, I found it to be quite like a broken in, relaxed Greenback. Like it was like, wow, it's like on the creamy dark side.
What do they rate it at? How many watts do they call that?
It's not 25. I think it's like it's 50 or 65 or something like that. So
they probably have some other more modern material on the former as well.
Yeah,
you've got good ears. I would lead them to your recommendation in that. I have not tried it, so I can only speculate.
It was to the point where with the PT15, my 15-watt amp, we tried them because I was like, this would be great. Because they say, I like the way it sounds. Let's try it in a 212 and see. And I thought it was cool, but I thought with a 15-watt amp, it's almost too relaxed. I thought I want a little bit more. So then we tried the regular Greenback, and it was like, yeah, it's got just a little bit more top end, a little bit more
Do you
authority
know what
to
the
it.
efficiency is? How many
I
watts?
don't.
Okay.
I should take a look.
I can
Actually,
look at it later, but go on. Any other questions we can get to?
Yeah, I should split pretty quick here. I've just got at a point. I got to go pick up some new contact lenses before I've got a little trip tomorrow. So, that probably pretty much about covers it.
I would maybe note real quick on something, brush on 67, 89 Marshalls.
Okay.
Marshalls went from and up till about 67, even in hundreds and fifties are a little bit different, but up to 67, they're way high voltage. And a lot of bottom end, they're more like a Tweed twin, especially if we were, say, talking about 100. And that's sort of your Allman Brothers and the big, heavy, fatter, simpler amp. And you can see it in the history of Marshall book. In 68 is a very transitionary year. The early 68s are still like 67s. The late 68s are already like 69s. There was 6 to 10 months to me is the holy grail period of Marshalls in that 67, 8, 9 period. And what he changed all of this, we didn't discuss this. A big thing for me has always been where a lot of other amp builders, I don't think, worry near as much about it, but the filtering and how loose tight a platform is in the power supply. Then that's what I'm saying, that you had a big, loose, yet highly charged, high voltage in a 67. 68, you get the voltage right. It still has the mid and lower end. You tend to more get into full EL34s, output transformer instead of the two, or like a 66 had two big 50 watts, whatever. But the 68 is in the middle, is a happy medium. If you look at the chassis in the history of Marshall, you'll see there's some with no of those blue caps sticking through the chassis. The good one has one blue cap sticking up through the chassis. Then the late one, like 69 and later, you get the gaggle of 4, the one by the power cord, and the one up in the front end that's got 6 big caps.
This is filtering we're talking about.
Yes, big filter caps, the big LCR blue filter caps that stick through them. That's how you're going to tell the difference. And even 67 will have no cap sticking up through it. But they made them, so just numbers wise, you don't need to know exactly what's what, but just numbers tell the story. A Tweed in early Marshalls, you have less than 100 total microfarad of filter caps. And they're the reservoir tanks of the energy in each stage of the amp. And you have to suck those dry before you get any squish in the amp. If they're very big, bang, but bang, 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 they're always there and they can always punch. When they were earlier lower filtered, bam, blam, blam, you're going to bog it down. When you can suck them dry, they have to pull the current to refill them. So it's always refilling when they're low, when you can deplete them. When they get to the 6, they're big and there's a ton and they never give. They're just a nice pick in your ear. The early ones loose and sloppy. The medium ones were just right. And that's what I'm saying with the one cap. Not too loose, not too tight, much more low end. So they tightened them way up. The main coupling caps between the phase inverter and the power tubes from 68 to 9, they leaned them out 2 clicks from big 0.1s down past 047s to 0.022s. So they got leaner, way tighter. They exaggerated the upper end, and the EQ change was the final other change. And from 69 onward, they have what I call the later EQ. The early one, just like a Bassman, Tweed Bassman. The early EQ is creamier. It's a little hard to breathe through. Good for single coils in your Marshall. A little greasy and fat for a humbucker. You do the later one, and this is why it became Les Paul Marshall or a 335. You needed the beef. They got so tight, so bright, and you're now whizzing through the EQ with much more upper end whizzing through, and you needed mahogany and humbuckers to darken down what became a very bright, tight, and crunchy amp. But that's why the 68 is the holy grail. Fuller coupled to the power section, right voltage, not too loose, not too tight. All these things were just right. Where that, and why others don't recognize this immediately. When I first played one, and I replaced the output to the normal type replacement, like even what's on a JCM 800, still good diagonal, but it was still incredible. But one chord, I'm telling you, especially in 1/412. The other point would be when they got too lean, bright, tight, and crunchy. To me, especially the 100, they need the full stack. That's where you get a little grease when you bog it down with 8 speakers. You finally get a little give in there, and that's okay. And then that's what those were about.
But then you needed like a 73 Pontiac station wagon to carry all the,
Right, but that 1/412 with the 69 and later, and that's just banking your head. Where the 68, you go plah, and it gives just right, and you got enough clarity, but not where it's super high voltage. That
Yeah.
they had the holy grail. They went past it. Why? Because Hendrix and Pete and all the boys playing the Forum or whatever with even with 4 or 5 stacks, they didn't have 50,000 watt PAs. You're
Right.
trying to fill the auditorium. All you care about is cut through the audience. You wanted more punch, so make it more ballsy, punchy. But they went past what's sweeter to the microphone and to your ear in the room, where it was a medium, to this very lean, bright, tight, and crunchy thing. That's the quick progression. And then you add G12Hs instead of greenbacks in the 70s, and it's a much tighter, more in your face thing than that Holy Grail 68.
That was
So I
a
just want to touch on
master.
that.
That was a master class right there in about 4 minutes of
Yeah, I just want to touch on
66,
that.
67 through 1970, 71, and what
Yeah.
happened. Yeah.
But I'm surprised when other guys, even there's some companies, they'll make a 65, a 67, a 69, a 70, whatever. They make a whole bunch of them, but I go, but you don't make the best one of them all, which is the
Titan.
68. Which to me, this is an ears thing, and that's, or maybe they've never heard it. But I'm telling you, one chord on that 68, and you go, there it is. Now, people like 69s and early 70s. To me, they're nothing like that. And then in the 100, they never made the 50. I've always made my 50 like that 100. We could get into that slightly different. But the other thing I will say about the 100, there's one last couple points. Oddly, they used forever Drake and Dagnall. They used two different companies on the transformers, on the 50 and 100. Like forever, even up through 800s, I believe it's still that way, even in today.
Yeah.
And I believe the 100 is a better quality, better sounding output transformer than the 50. You'll notice 100s outsold 50s by a mile. There's not nearly as many 50s as there are 100. And I'm telling you, because people knew they play 100 and they play a 50. The 100 is way better. That's the quintessential super magic to me of the all-out Marshall sound. And it's because the same way 4 EL84s handle the low end that you want to try to feed it in a Vox compared to 2. An AC-15, AC-30, very, very different animals. There's no headroom in a 15, in 2 EL84s. You get 4 much more girth and full range, and there's a lot more low end in an AC-30. It's a little different in the 50 to 100, but the way 4 EL34s, which are lean tubes, not as generally big in the bottom end, it's the way the 4 power tubes with their headroom handle the low end while it still had it in 68 before you leaned it out in 69 and later. And then how those 4 tubes saturate that Dagnall, I believe it is, on the 100, is all the magic that makes a 100 better than a 50 in the old days. I can make it with the same company and the same everything, and you can get the 50-watt version. But that's why I think, and historically, the 100 and the 6800 is, and it supposedly is in the History Marshall book, the Van Halen first 2 records amp is the 68 Magical One.
Sure.
And so I was never as much chasing that exactly, but it does turn out that it was even that mighty machines were. And that I've heard even long ago that Jose would mod them. If you had a later 72, he would bring it back to 68 kind of specs and then do his mod, his gain thing to it. But he knew the magic, I think, of that 68 happy medium there as well. So, but like I say, if anybody ever heard that and doesn't say, let's hone in on that, like that's where the magic platform is. It's like, you hear it differently than I do. Like I say, I started on high watts and then into much of my years were Marshalls, but not that big of a fan of a high watt. It's too cluggy. It's, again, feels like a bass amp and
right. It's different.
Not as rock and roll.
Well, one of these days I'll have to do, there'll be a video here of the changes through the eras and what because this would be a great YouTube video of like the, moving from 66, 67, 68, 69, 70. Changing the filtering, changing, sort of early JTM 45 spec to more of the lead spec to, the changes in the EQ and stuff. And we can listen and then hone in on the, and I think that would be great just as a historical document. I've got to run because the iDoc's going to be bummed if I don't go. But hey, this is amazing. You can see folks are really, Christopher says, I'm an instant fan. I'll be looking at top end amps going forward. I recommend you do because Brian, an old friend of mine, and, it's really great to reconnect. And I learned so much from you back in the day. And so this was amazing. Let's do it again. Let's do a part 2. Maybe, I can hone in on some questions from people, like specific things and stuff. We can focus on some real specific topics and
Sure.
stuff, and do a part 2 one of these days soon.
Enjoyed it very much, and you have a great day and a safe trip there, my friend.
Okay, hang for a second, then I'll say goodbye, but I'm going to sign off on the broadcast. So, folks, won't be around tomorrow, Sunday morning. This was my live stream for this week, but next week I'll be back on Sunday. So we'll see you. We'll see you soon. I think that's the 24th. I think something like that. So we'll see. We'll see you in a week and more. I'm a little slow on the YouTube videos. I'll say right now too. I took a couple gigs. One in Florida that you may or may not have heard about. I did that. And then also I'm headed out to do another one this week. I just had to get out of here for a minute. I had to go play and do something besides YouTube and stuff. Because after 2 years of YouTube, I was going bonkers, so it's just been it's been a good thing for me to get out and play a little bit and stuff. But
utilize your vast skills there, my friend. The world needs it.
You got to play. You got to get out of it. You can't exist in a vacuum. So, yeah. But thank you again so much, man. Hang up for a sec. I'll see you guys real soon.
Bye-bye.
Take care.